Chapter 1726. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:58 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 1726. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1726. Upheaval. Aina snapped awake after a long and deep sleep. Honestly, she would have woken up much later, but for some reason, the room she shared with Lionel had gotten so hot that even she was sweating. The moment even she felt uncomfortable, it was bound to be guaranteed that something had gone wrong. When she woke up, she lifted off the covers to find that it had practically become a sauna beneath the sheets. Lionel lay by her side, pale and covered from head to toe in sweat. From time to time, he would tremble and his heart rate would accelerate, only for it to calm for just a few seconds before it happened again. By now, if it wasn't for the fact that she and Lionel had become sixth-dimensional existences, and had been cleansed more times than they could count by the cleansing waters, the stench in the room would have probably already become unbearable. Aina frowned, a deep line of worry marring the delicate lines of her forehead. She had just been in one of the most blissful sleeps of her life, all to suddenly be thrust into this situation. She tried to reach forward and wake Lionel, but he caught her wrist somewhat tightly for a moment before letting go. Although he didn't say anything, Aina could tell that he wanted to be left alone. Whatever he was going through, he could clearly come out of it whenever he wanted and simply chose not to. Considering his dream force affinity, he was probably one of the very few in existence who could simultaneously be stuck in an illusion, and yet also be hyper-aware of what was happening in the real world. Aina sighed. She had just been asleep for a small while, yet he had gone to get himself into trouble again. This man really wouldn't let her know peace. Despite this, Aina smiled. After a while, she found a towel and moistened it with cool water before gently dabbing at his forehead. She didn't know what he was going through right now, but this was the only thing she could do for him. While Lionel was embroiled in a battle of willpower and pride, the human domain was slowly being embroiled in its own sort of war, one that had been brewing for the better part of the last over 20 years. However, with the appearance of the cloud race thanks to Lionel, it seemed to have supercharged something that was already a volatile powder keg. DiVincenzo and the Void Elders went off in hot pursuit of the 3 Cloud Race members, catching 2 of them, Captain Zilgella and Captain Urieth. As powerful as those 3 Cloud Race members were, while it was still possible for them to escape the likes of DiVincenzo, the Void Elders were simply on an entirely different level. It could only be said that the Cloud Race members were truly unlucky. The Void Elders would never participate in something so small usually. It was only because they happened to be present and nearby that they acted this time around, leading to such a result. It was because of this, though, that it was a mystery to how the likes of Captain Vimward could escape them. However, this embarrassment for Shield Cross Stars didn't end here, and it could be said that this was a greater humiliation than anything Lionel could have personally done to them. After the capture of Zilgella and Urieth, they were handed off to the members of Shield Cross Stars to interrogate. Although dealing with outsider threats was usually the jurisdiction of the Void Palace, due to the oddity of the situation and the fact it was in regard to the inner workings of the human domain's police force, it was left to DiVincenzo to interrogate the prisoners and escort them back. After all, any other potential spies and traitors had to be weeded out as quickly as possible. But who could have expected that on the way back to the main headquarters of Shield Cross Stars that Captain Vimward would actually appear again, this time with backup. Without his flagship, the formation of DiVincenzo's fleet lacked a core and struggled in its usual coordination. Due to this weakness, the sudden ambush of Vimward and his fellow Cloud Race people was too difficult to counter, especially after Shield Cross Stars was caught completely off guard. DiVincenzo fought tooth and nail, but ultimately, the methods of the Cloud Race were too numerous, and those that they dared to send into the human domain were only the absolute elites among elites. Although the casualties on the side of the humans wasn't particularly high, and could even be said to be very good given the circumstances, they weren't able to retain the 2 prisoners, and they were swiftly taken away. This news rang across the human domain, and the rapid in-succession follies of Shield Cross Stars raised several eyebrows. The loss of a Tier 2 star ship, the failure to capture of a 20-some-year-old junior, the infiltration of the Cloud Race into their ranks, and then the subsequent loss of the prisoners. All of this was only made worse that Captain Vimward, the only one among the three to escape in the first place, had been under the pursuit of DiVincenzo to begin with. If he had been pursued by a Void Elder, even if he grew extra legs, escape would have been impossible. The level of incompetence was so high that not only was DiVincenzo was not only demoted, he was detained and court-martialed under suspicion of being a member of the Cloud Race himself. Lionel would probably find this fact to be hilarious, but in truth, from the perspective of the human race, this was an important precaution to take. There seemed to be too many coincidences for all of this to have happened. Unwilling to admit potential personal fault, S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars chose to use DiVincenzo as a scapegoat and claim him to be a member of the Cloud Race from the very beginning. The entire human domain was in an uproar. Just how far did this conspiracy go? How far had the Cloud Race infiltrated into their ranks? Chapter 1727. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:58 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1727. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1727. Ridiculous bang. Two palms hit a desk so hard that a trembling impact surged throughout the city. The fury behind it was clear, and even that floor-to-ceiling windows behind the individual shattered to pieces, sprinkling down to the streets behind him. However, by some miracle, the desk itself was perfectly intact. Outside of some light trembling, it maintained its frame, even the floor beneath it not experiencing even the slightest tremor. The two individuals standing before the infuriated man didn't so much as flinch. It was clear that they were very much used to this scene, and maybe that was why such an investment had been made into this furious man's desk to begin with. This furious man, though, wasn't a simple individual at all. In fact, he was one of the very few above Tier 1 star officers of S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars, one of only 8. To put this matter into perspective, the title of Tier 1 star rank was so rare that despite the fact they were always looking for more officers, they could simply not find anyone both worthy and willing to dedicate their lives to being a policeman. As for those above Tier 1 star officer, they were veterans no lesser in stature than Void Elders. They were known as the Cross Elders, and their position was designed to have 9 members taking up the rank at any given time. But much like the ranks of Tier 1 star officer, there simply weren't enough worthy individuals. As such, a position designed for 9 could only have 8. This man was none other than Cross Elder Avon. A man both known for his valiant service to the human race, and just as well known for his fiery temper. The two individuals across from Cross Elder Avon were 2 Tier 1 star rank officers. However, other than not showing fear in the face of his outburst, the two didn't dare to show the slightest disrespect. Although there seemed to be just a single rank between themselves and Cross Elder, the gap might as well have been insurmountable. The difference was akin to a member of the Void Senate of the Void Palace, or even a domain-ranked disciple, and a Void Elder. It simply wasn't meant to be compared. Incompetent. 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 Cross Elder Avon spoke so furiously that the words were almost entirely incoherent. The louder he got, the less sense he seemed to make, so they could only assume he was repeating the same word over and over again. The 2-star rank officers before him, 1 man and 1 woman, could only continue to clasp their hands behind their backs, standing tall. I want them found now. Vishna, Corden, get it done. I don't care how you do it, I just want results. Vishna, the brown-skinned beauty between the two, and Corden, a bulky man with a round but steel-like gut, looked toward one another. Even without saying a word, they knew well what "I don't care how you do it" meant in this context. On the one hand, it meant exactly what it stated. But on the other hand, it was also a scapegoat flag. Sure, they could do whatever they wanted, but if they were caught, then they'd become the next DiVincenzo. Sir, what do we do about Earth? Vishnu finally asked after a moment of listening to Avon's heated breathing. Upon hearing Earth, Avon's forehead gained a new vein moonlighting as a slithering crimson python. It really looked as though his head might burst like a watermelon any moment now. Avon had, of course, heard the news that Eleanor Morales was actually the princess of the Ascension Empire. However, this shocking news had been overwhelmed by all the matters that came afterward. He had only just now remembered that he had even more to be infuriated about. The 24-hour period that Eleanor had given was quickly approaching, and no orders had been sent just yet. Between the cloud race matter and the escape of their prisoners to this moment right here, everything had happened so quickly that it was difficult to deal with. Earth was a troublesome matter to begin with, because the Shield Cross star's branches in its vicinity were weak. This was because the Milky Way galaxy was fairly classified as a more primitive galaxy in comparison to the others. They had by far the most number of third and fourth dimensional worlds in the whole of the human domain. However, since then, Earth had expanded far outside the range of their original galaxy, and had even quickly swallowed up several sectors. This led to an odd situation where the core of Earth's territory had the weakest Shield Cross star's influence while the outer reaches of its territory had the strongest. Even Shield Cross stars hadn't expected Earth to progress so rapidly. Usually it took thousands upon tens of thousands of years just to improve through a single dimension, even if you had far greater potential. However, Earth had somehow made it from the third dimension to the seventh in less than half a century. This threw many of the original plans Shield Cross stars had had out of the window, and it left them in an awkward position. Now they were suddenly being kicked out of the territory before they could even establish themselves. Ridiculous. 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 Spittle flew from Cross Elder Avon's mouth, and some even somehow ended up on his balding, wrinkled head. However, so much heat was coming off of him that it evaporated into nothingness in just a few moments. After a moment, Cross Elder Avon calmed and sat down in what remained of his chair, the wind from the shattered windows fluttering what remained of his hair. Then he sneered. The Morales want to play games, huh? Well, see how long that lasts. As for the Ascension Empire, they want to be free of us? Sure, fine, let them be free. I can't wait to see how long it'll take for them to come crawling back. Order your subordinates to keep an eye out for that brat. The fugitives of the human race can't run around just because of who their mommy and daddy are. Forget the other matters, go do as you're told. Avon waved a hand and time seemed to reverse as the shattered window shards flew back into place and melted back into place. Chapter 1728. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:58 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1728. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1728. Rupture. Lionel gasped for breath, something he had suddenly become very used to doing. He didn't think that he would enter such a state for a long while thanks to how much vitality he had pumped into himself using his metal body. But here he was suffering. After a while, Lionel stopped being pissed off and even became a bit languid. Emotion could only really get you so far. Eventually you would tire of it. Being enraged all the time was exhausting. People weren't designed to be that way. The lows only hurt because they were the lows, not the baseline. And highs were only so satisfying because they were such a change from the norm, not a constant. By the same token, drudging up willpower just because you were angry wasn't good enough. Even the most vindictive person couldn't be angry forever. There would always be a time where it faded into the background, and you were forced to feel different emotions. But that was also precisely why Lionel never wanted to rely on emotion. Lionel rose up again. By now the gap between the stairs was far too large to rely on nothing other than his physical prowess. It simply wasn't enough. But Lionel had already realized that this wasn't a trial of his body, so obviously the solution to jumping across these enormous barriers was in his mind. He would either have to force these stairs to come closer, or he would have to get more powerful and larger. Lionel roared, his height increasing by an entire foot. This was nothing more than a projection of himself, a representation of his body in the form of dream force. In that case, he would just make himself larger. But in doing so, Lionel leapt forward again, his body practically undergoing a shuddering seizure as he leapt through the air. He landed and rolled across the platform, his body spasming. It was about what he expected. The larger he made his body here, the more dream force he would have to flood in, and the more dream force he flooded in, the deeper the hooks of this tablet would be able to sink into his real body. And the deeper those hooks entered, the more real and terrible the backlash would be. It was getting to the point where the fear was becoming crippling. In the beginning he only had to shake his head to recover, but as he climbed he was beginning to take several seconds, but the time he crossed the 1000th step, it took him several minutes. The real-world effects were becoming more devastating as well. Having his body enter a constant state of fight or flight didn't seem like a big deal at first, but it was frying his neurons and pushing his body to the limit. His heart rate was constantly above an allowable threshold even given his body, the less immediately important functions of his body like digestion, and the like. More and more stores of energy were being flooded directly into his muscles, and the amount of calories he was burning a second just maintaining the obscene heat he was giving off, not to mention his constantly shivering body, would very quickly put him at the brink of death. The truth was that time was dilated between the tablet and the real world. It was all too easy to fool the mind. Lionel felt that he had been climbing for months, years even, but his real body had only experienced a few hours. Even so, because his mind was going through so many terrible effects again and again, he was quickly losing muscle mass and the walls of his heart were growing thinner as his body started to eat itself to maintain. The brain simply had too much power of the body. Even illusions when taken to an extreme could cause real and deadly consequences. However, disregarding this entirely, Lionel continued forward. Aina could only watch as Lionel's skin became more sunken, his muscles deflating and his skin beginning to stick to his body. It wasn't long before his breathing became nothing more than his ribcage moving up and down while his bronze skin lost all color and became an unhealthy and pasty greenish-gray color. Within the tablet world, Lionel could still not see the end of the staircase. When he looked back, he could no longer even see where he had started, and that was despite now being over 10 meters tall. He was relentless in his pursuit and his mind had stopped thinking. Everything outside of calculating how hard he needed to jump to reach the next platform was already thrown out of his mind. Again and again he would jump, stumble, fall and roll, only to pick himself up several minutes later after he was finished foaming at the mouth to do it again. The worry on Aina's face grew with every passing mind, but she could only continue to dab at his forehead, her golden irises flickering with a somewhat fearful light. It really looked as though Lionel would push himself too far and die. Lionel, however, had no intention of stopping. He didn't know it consciously, but he had already reached a state where he would rather die than give in. Maybe had he known this consciously, he would have snapped out of it and thought it to be ridiculous. This matter wasn't worth dying over. He had too many things to do now. But in that moment, with his mind focused on one thing and one thing only, he was relentless in his pursuit. Lionel jumped again, his body reaching over 100 meters as he landed on the 10,000th step. Just like always, he slipped and fell, his body beginning to convulse once again. But this time was different. In the real world, the walls of his heart had become far too thin. This time when it tried to pump too fast beyond its limits, it ruptured and a spray of blood came from Lionel's mouth. Aina went pale, but she suddenly felt a hand on her wrist. Despite the state of his body, his hand seemed to have a great amount of strength. Within the platform world, Lionel slowly stood to his feet again, his projection rippling like an image cast on water. Again. At that moment, while Lionel was pushing himself beyond normal bounds of reason, a fleet of ships had come to a stop near the borders of Earth's territory. But for some odd reason, the flagship that they were waiting on to pass through this area was nowhere to be seen. Of course, this flagship they were waiting on was none other than the very one Lionel had stolen. Chapter 1729. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:58 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1729. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1729. Running out. Bang. Roar. A hand clasped onto the side of a platform, its fingernails bent and twisted, its tendons and ligaments rising like roaring veins that just might pop out at any moment. Lionel pushed with all his might, the fear coming in waves. He had already reached his limits, the size of his body having been pushed beyond even the realms of reason. He stood several kilometers tall, and even this was only just barely enough to catch the ledge of the platform. Withstanding the barrage of thoughts of inadequacy, of giving up, of being unworthy, all while trying to climb to the very peak was difficult. Too difficult even to put into words. Even though he could feel the ledge. Even though he knew well that he was just a single great push away from climbing to its peak. It still felt like he was falling into an abyss. The clutches of devils and demons waiting for him below, fully prepared to swallow him up whole. His fingernails snapped and tore, rivers of blood flowing out. His pinky's ligament gave out first, snapping like a steel cord and ripping his finger back at an awkward angle. The backlash was so great that it felt as though something had taken his finger and peeled it back to his wrist, wanting him to suffer the most unimaginable pain. Another snap rang out, and this time it was his ring finger that was peeled back almost like the skin of an onion. The strength of his body was playing sticks against him. Each one of his muscle fibers was like tempered steel, intertwined into a cord that layered the muscles and organs of his body. But because of this, when they gave out, the effects were resounding and devastating. Every time one gave up, a bang would resound through his body as though a clap of thunder had resonated within his skeleton. Lionel's had just barely managed to peek over the ledge. He slammed his down on it, using it as leverage in an attempt to pull himself over. His expression was ghastly, his face pulsing with veins and his teeth shattering one by one under the pressure like fragile porcelain dolls. He pushed with all his might. Roar! The shot came out muddled and gargled. He didn't have the strength to open his jaw with so much weight pressing up on it. However, he managed to gain some momentum in an attempt to swing his foot up and onto the ledge. Just as his heel was about to snag a piece of the ledge, another snap rang out. Lionel's body shuddered and his middle finger's ligament snapped. By this point, he only had one arm left, while it seemed like only the ligaments of one hand were being snapped. That was because the tendons that connected his other arm had snapped during the last climb. Before this, Lionel could just use his dream force to repair the projection of this body. But by this point, things had been going on so long that he truly had nothing left. Even his overwhelming dream force stamina was running thin. This was the last body he had. He simply couldn't repair it, and if he fell here, he would truly fall to his death. With the state of his body in the real world, it couldn't handle true damage to his soul. In fact, the only thing keeping him from dying currently was the independence of his soul. He couldn't fall here. He refused to fall here. Another one of Lionel's teeth shattered beneath the pressure, cracks running through it like fissures in concrete beneath the wrath of an earthquake. He held on with his jaw on one side, and with his remaining forefinger on the other. These were the last two anchor points he had, the last barriers holding him up from a fall to an inevitable death. Lionel's gaze was entirely crimson. There wasn't a hint of the pale violet remaining. He gazed upward with the look of a madman. By this point, he had forgotten what he was fighting so hard against. He didn't even know if he ever really had been fighting for something at all. All he knew was that he wanted to take another step forward, and then another. This matter had started off without much thought. He wasn't in any rush to suddenly become many times stronger, and he had already become content with the strength he had. It was the same cycle he always went through. For a moment he would feel a burst of motivation caused by an existential threat to his life or someone he loved. He would then raise his battle strength quickly in a short time, and then he would crush his adversaries only to come out the other end bored. But this time it was different. He had just claimed a resounding victory, and yet here he was, struggling on the border of life and death. Maybe at some point during this journey, he had felt a chance, even if it was a small one, to take a step in the right direction. And to take that step before he faced something that even he couldn't quickly think his way out of. Maybe that was why he was so unwilling to give up. Maybe something was telling him that he was running out of time. Roar! The whites of Lionel's eyes turned entirely crimson, a blinding and bloody light illuminating them. Snap! His forefinger gave way, but he quickly swung his arm up. This time when he roared, he had just barely been able to open his mouth, which pushed his body up just far enough for him to swing his shoulder over the ledge. Lionel's mouth opened up for just a moment before his mouth came clamping down again. The sound of shattering teeth resounded, but Lionel had already used the leverage his shoulder gave him to swing his feet up. This time he aimed even higher. Even as his teeth shattered, his heel hit the platform and he rolled his shoulder forward. With a final furious push, Lionel swung his head down with all his might, slamming his forehead against the top of the platform, and using the violent momentum to push the rest of his body over the ledge. Chapter 1730. Published at 7th of April, 2023, 8:58 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1730. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1730. Next, Lionel felt his head spinning. That final blow was so powerful that he had most definitely shattered his skull. Blood flew from his nose and ears, shared of his own bones sticking into the most important frontal networks of his brain. However, even while feeling so dizzy, he struggled to prop himself up, his mind repeating the very same action he had every other time as he rose through this world. The platform he had started on was barely enough for two of him to stand on, but this one was tens of kilometers wide and long. Even so, after making himself several kilometers tall, it would only take a few rolls for him to reach the end of it. Realizing that he didn't have the strength to stand, Lionel could only do that. He didn't want to stop his momentum. He felt like if he wavered even once, he paused even once, he would no longer have the strength or courage to continue. He had to keep going. The moment the fear response cleared, he had to keep moving, no matter what. He grit his teeth, ignoring the pain of rolling over his injured hands and arms as he made it to the edge of the platform. Just one more roll and he would fall off to his death. Only then did Lionel come to a stop, blinking several times and trying to see the distance between this platform and the next one so that he could judge exactly how much strength he had to gather to reach it. However, at first glance, Lionel didn't see anything. His vision was quite blurry. So he blinked again, even weakly wiping at his eyes with his forearm before he could look again. But even then, he couldn't see it. Lionel's heart froze over. Could it be that the next platform was so far away that he couldn't see it despite its surely overwhelming size? Just by a rudimentary calculation, it would take being a few thousand miles away at the very least. He was already several kilometers tall and the pain was unbearable. He had already pushed his dream force to the max and couldn't get any larger. Even if he could get larger, could he really withstand what would happen to his body if the fear response suddenly became 1,000 times more potent? Lionel jaw steeled, the shards of broken teeth in his mouth digging into his gums as he used the more acute pain to pain him up. He slowly rolled to his knees, standing up. It took him several minutes, but he finally managed to get to his feet and look right up into the vast and endless skies. He took a deep breath, glaring upward as though he was looking at his worst enemy, but at that moment, the platform began to shimmer and shine. Lionel, who was still thinking about how he would reach the next staircase, suddenly felt his body enveloped by a caressing sort of light. The injuries to his projection were quickly being healed. His tendons and ligaments snapped back into place. His grotesquely curled fingers were pulled back, and even his teeth and fractured jaw began to mend themselves. Lionel looked down with a hint of surprise, not understanding for a moment until it hit him. It wasn't that the next platform was so far away. It was that he had already reached the last platform. He had already lost count of the number of platforms he had climbed, but he had stopped keeping track because doing so was only attacking his psyche. Having to worry about how far he had gone and trying to guess how far he had left to go would have only worn down his mind and made him more likely to give up. He had shunned all such thoughts, so much so that he hadn't even considered the fact that he had truly reached the end. Lionel stood in silence for a moment, thinking back to everything he had gone through. He probably should have felt happy or relieved, but he didn't feel that way at all. All that pain, all that horror, he just felt like if he juxtaposed it to his usual methods, the latter was far too inferior. If he was honest with himself, he had never worked so hard before. Compared to Aina, he was far inferior in this respect. Lionel took a breath. In the outside world, his body had truly become little different from a skeleton wearing a bit of skin. But for the first time in a long while, his condition didn't deteriorate, and even seemed to become a bit better. Although he didn't suddenly recover immediately, he at least seemed to stabilize somewhat. Lionel didn't even need to personally observe the current state of his body to know that instant recovery wouldn't work on him. He had pushed himself so far that he would need true time and rest. Back when the Cobra demon had eaten him alive, it was only by snatching strength from the demon that he had been able to recover. This proved that there was a certain point of no return, even for instant recovery, unless it gained outside support with the help of the healing branch of the dark force side of the lineage factor. Regardless, this wasn't a problem that Lionel was too bothered by. Although his body was a bit weak, it wasn't as though he was helpless. And right now, he was more concerned with what exactly reaching the final platform meant. It couldn't be that it would just recover his dream force, right? In truth, even if this was the case, Lionel found himself not minding as much as he thought it was. This may be one of the few times where he felt he had gotten more out of the hardship than the reward waiting on the other end of it. However, it was a guarantee that things wouldn't be so simple. It was potentially time to truly learn what the Emperor Might lineage factor could do. Lionel's projection was enveloped by a light and brought to a new place. When he appeared, he stood in another world of green and blue. There were bubbles all around him, some of which were delicate and pale green color, and others of which were radiant and blinding royal blue colors. Chapter 1731. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:06 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 1731. True Sovereign. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. By this point, Lionel was certain that the greenish-blue colors meant something that he wasn't aware of. Although he had stopped paying attention to the platform so that he didn't psyche himself out, he still had noticed that the started from pale shades of green, become more vibrant jade colors, then transform toward a bluish tinge before stopping at an almost diamond-like bluish color that was maybe one of the most beautiful colors Lionel had ever seen. If he had been in the state of mind to care back then, the final several dozen kilometer-long and wide platform he had just been on would have been acknowledged by him as one of the most beautiful polished gems he had ever seen. Now that Lionel thought about it, the Fox family's emperors might manifested with a vibrant green color. This didn't seem like a coincidence. Only his kings might manifested with a violet color, but that was only due to a mutation that came from his metal synergy lineage factor. Originally, Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor became tainted with a crimson force when he almost deviated the first time he tried to awaken it. However, after he fought back and succeeded in awakening it, a violet color was born. This violet color wasn't something that Lionel was keenly aware of the presence of until he formed King's Might lineage factor in the Valiant Heart Zone. However, this violet color appeared even when he wasn't consciously using King's Might, like when he fully deployed his metal synergy lineage factor. Lionel shook his head and stopped minding these matters for now. The intertwining of his lineage factor made what was going on inside of his body greatly complicated. He wouldn't be able to figure it all out even within a few years. His best chance was to personally go through the records of the Morales. But that would have to wait. Lionel reached forward and touched one of the smaller pale green bubbles. Since he wasn't certain of what they were, although he did have a guess, it was better if he chose to be cautious first. The bubble popped and a surge of energy entered Lionel's body. Not only did he suddenly feel like his soul had been greatly nourished, growing not just a few times stronger, but mysterious patterns and runes began to formulate in his mind. After a while, Lionel blinked and opened his eyes shining wink with a frown. Emperor's aura. As expected, it was a method of utilization designed precisely for the Emperor's Might lineage factor. But in addition to this, the process of assimilating these usage methods also seemed to strengthen his soul, branding it with odd runes that reminded Lionel a lot of god runes or star runes. Lionel's gaze twinkled with a peculiar light. Emperor's aura, from the description, was something he had always had. It made sense that this was the smallest and easiest bubble there was to assimilate here, since he had been using it since long before he was even consciously aware of having this lineage factor. For as long as he could remember, every time Lionel got serious, a suffocating aura would pervade from him. He wasn't actually aware of this, but others had always told him that this was the case. In fact, one of the reasons he always finished his tests so quickly back in Class A was to give everyone else a chance. However, this bubble had taught him how to consciously deploy it, and how to also be aware that he was doing it. Although it was the smallest bubble here, that didn't mean that it was a weak ability. It was just that it was a fundamental ability. So fundamental that most would have access to it the moment they awakened this lineage factor. In fact, even Lionel's cousin Noah had Emperor's aura. How powerful this ability would become, though, was dependent on several factors. Factors that Lionel had a feeling were related to just how far you climbed. If this explanation was correct, even using aura to suffocate people to the point they couldn't use their force was possible. It even explained that even if completely stopping people from using their force was impossible, You could lower the strength of their force. Essentially, if Lionel had had access to the full scope of Emperor's aura during his battle with the Cobra Demon or Thela, he could use it to weaken their force manipulation, and even potentially bring it down to a realm that he could more easily deal with. Lionel took a breath and moved forward. He suppressed his desire to start popping the biggest bubbles around here. Although he could sense he had earned the right after climbing to the highest platform, he had a feeling that he might very well implode if he even tried. What Lionel didn't know was that climbing to the highest platform had done more for him than just give him access. It was also the reason learning was so easy. Usually, one would have to master these runes personally before being able to properly use them, but all Lionel had to do was pop the bubble, and it would integrate the full meaning of it for him. Lionel reached out toward the second smallest bubble. This was a slightly brighter shade of green than the last one. Emperor's projection. This was a skill that gathered Emperor's aura and formed a projection. Through this projection, Emperor's aura could be applied to one's force. Through doing this and concentrating Emperor's aura, its effects would become more potent. This was another ability that Lionel knew about, and he had even formed his Emperor's projection before through a skill he had learned from his mother. It seemed that his mother had meditated on the Emperor's might lineage factor enough that she had formulated a path through these inheritances herself, without having the tablet. Even so, seeing the full method here and having it directly imprinted onto his brain, Lionel realized that he had neglected this skill far too often. And he also realized that in the past when he integrated his destruction aura with it, the process hadn't needed to be so permanent. The only reason he had thought it was permanent was because he had so little understanding of the skill. Now, however, its full breadth was imprinted directly into his psyche. He understood it better than anyone else in existence currently, which also meant Lionel reached out a finger and formed a small blade of spear force. Soon, numerous runes began to appear on its golden surface before it gained a small tinge of violet, giving it a truly royal air. Although Lionel had never seen it before, right this moment he was absolutely certain. This was the true sovereign spear. Chapter 1732. Published at 10th of April, 2023. 11:06 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1732. Emperor's presence. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked down at the radiant spear force for a long while before he crushed it in his palm. He was absolutely certain that this was the so-called true sovereignty that those women of that zone were speaking of. He could feel a qualitative change that relied on something beyond just the ring on his finger. But likewise, since it didn't rely on his ring, it had its own strengths and weaknesses. For one, Lionel could apply it to his bow force and become a true sovereign of the bow as well. However, unlike his spear force, which was immune to all other spears and spear forces, his bow force would be limited to restricting bow forces weaker than his own. This, though, was only natural. Of course, Lionel had already reached this stage with his bow force even without his king's might lineage factor. The reason why during his battles in the Void Palace that bow force seemed to be easily absorbed by him was because he had crossed this threshold on his own. Now though, Lionel formed bow force, using Emperor's presence to infuse Emperor's aura into it. At that moment, his white bow force shimmered with a resplendent violet color, even more obvious than what had been the case with his spear force. The change in its strength wasn't small. Lionel could feel the minor fluctuations everywhere it passed, his level of control over it reaching an unprecedented level. This wasn't exactly a matter of power, per se, but instead the dominion over which he could maintain perfect accuracy had increased by not just a single fold. Lionel crushed the bow force in his hand and formed a strand of fire. This fire force was one he hadn't used in a very long time, radiant force. It had radioactive properties, and it had once been a very core part of Lionel's heavenly cycle comprehensions, until they had evolved under the influence of the zone. Lionel was very curious. There was nothing that said that weapon forces were the only forces he could use Emperor's presence on. Logically, he should be able to apply it to almost any force. With a thought, he fused his presence into it, causing the silvery red flame to gain just the slightest hint of violet. Lionel immediately noticed that depending on what his target was, the vessel could accept more or less of his Emperor's aura. For example, his bow force absorbed by far the most, while his spear force absorbed comparatively less, and his radiant force absorbed even less than that. Among the three, spear force and bow force were still somewhat comparable, but radiant force might as well have been on its own scale in a negative direction. But at the same time, this didn't necessarily mean that the results were lackluster. In fact, Lionel could feel that the changes to radiant force weren't small. The main difference, in his estimation, was that radiant force wasn't a good enough representation of fire force in general. Lionel flipped another palm over. This one contained Scarlet Star Force. The moment he started flooding his Emperor's aura into it, it was as though it was a vast and boundless ocean, taking in more than he could even give it. Compared to his bow force, it was even several steps beyond. In fact, beneath its presence, his radiant force was quickly snuffed out. That was when Lionel came to an understanding. Using his King's Might lineage factor, he could gain a shortcut to becoming a sovereign. However, he needed to use a force as a proxy first. The quality of his sovereignship would be dependent on the quality of this force. Lionel's bow force had experienced the very same baptizing his spear force had. However, it was in the 6th dimension while his spear force was still in the 5th. As such, his bow force was stronger in this regard than his spear force by not just a small margin. Radiant force was a weaker fire force which was capped at the 6th dimension. As such, the pressure it could exert over other fire forces was minimal, while Scarlet Star Force was, of course, the strongest fire force in all of existence. Obviously, using the latter as a proxy to exert pressure onto other fire forces was far superior. Essentially, if Lionel used his Emperor's aura on his radiant force, many fire forces would become useless against him, but not all of them. If he did the same with his Scarlet Star Force, however, it would likely be impossible for others to even stir fire force in his presence. Aside from this, there was only really one other important thing of note, and that was that Lionel only seemed to be able to use his Emperor's aura on one type of force at a given time. For example, he could use Emperor's presence on Radiant Force and Scarlet Star Force at the same time. But he could use it on Scarlet Star Force and Spear Force at the same time. Nor could he use it on Spear Force and Bow Force at the same time. Lionel didn't mind this limitation very much as its foundational abilities alone were very excellent. In addition, these should actually be the simplest abilities the tablet had in store for him. There were still dozens more bubbles floating in the air. After a moment, Lionel looked toward the bubbles again. He hadn't reached his limit yet, and there seemed to be no reason to stop, so why should he? If he had to master these techniques himself, he might consider stopping here. But considering they assimilated with his mind perfectly, wouldn't he be too stupid to not take advantage? He had exchanged a lot of blood, sweat and tears to get here. He reached forward and touched another bubble, this one being third from last in terms of size and radiance. A familiar nourishing feeling took hold of his soul, cleansing him from head to toe and making him feel alive. It truly felt like he was floating on a cloud. Emperor's Gaze. Chapter 1733. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:06 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 1733. What right? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Emperor's Gaze. This was a technique that built off the back of Emperor's Presence, fusing it instead into a person's eyes. However, unlike the Bow Domain lineage factor, this technique wasn't actually designed to see any further, though it could be used to see with more clarity. The most basic usage and implementation of this technique was to disperse illusions and to attack the psyche. These both relied on similar principles and managed to accomplish two different things relying on the same foundation. Ultimately, illusions were just tricks of the mind and Emperor's Gaze could disrupt them. By the same token, it could piggyback off this ability to directly attack the mind of an enemy. When Lionel finished assimilating with the technique, his gaze couldn't help but glow. His pale violet irises becoming a deeper hue of violet for a moment before reverting back to their original color. This technique, wasn't it very similar to a technique of the spirituals? In fact, wasn't it precisely because of techniques like this that running into a spiritual boss in the Void Tower was no different from drawing dead? The human race only dared to battle against spirituals when they had soul protection treasures on hand. Without them, Meeting a spiritual race individual of the same and similar dimensional strength was basically a guaranteed in-skill. Humans had too little research done on the soul and hadn't created any techniques for it themselves. As such, they were all too vulnerable in this respect and could do nothing against those who did have such techniques. Just by virtue of gaining Emperor's gaze, Lionel had basically become as difficult to deal with as a spiritual. The only ones who could combat against him were either individuals in the seventh dimension who also had soul force or dream force-based ability indexes or lineage factors, or those who carried around soul protection treasures. However, in both instances, these demographics should be somewhat rare. At the very least, one would have to be from a prominent family of at least a sixth-dimensional territory to carry around a soul protection treasure. The other ability of Emperor's Gaze, to dispel illusions, was also quite good. Lionel was already fairly immune to illusions, but that wasn't the case for those around him. Now he had a tangible method of crushing any illusion he or his allies faced, and this could be greatly helpful in the future. Lionel's eyes cleared and runes danced and rotated in his irises before slowly fading. He didn't feel like he was anywhere near his limits, so he reached forward and tried the fourth. A refreshing feeling washed over him again, and the runes of another technique imprinted itself onto his soul. Emperor's Seal. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Even the name alone was domineering. However, the description of the technique itself was even more soul-shuddering. Emperor's Seal was an application of Emperor's aura and Emperor's presence. Using the latter, it formulated the former into a grand seal that manifested into the air. This seal would be used to directly suppress, imprison and crush. Even if Lionel hadn't had any spatial affinity, he could use Emperor's Seal to lock down space, similar to what the warships of Shield Cross Stars had done to the Void Palace. Like this, even if someone had a great spatial affinity, it would become useless. Emperor's Seal was quite similar to a domain-like ability, and it functioned on a more ethereal level than Lionel's gravity domain. While one targeted the physical body, the other targeted force and the soul. However, both of them were able to cause physical changes. Beneath Emperor's Seal, even though it ultimately was a suppression of the soul, the body would find it a very difficult move and force would become extremely sluggish. In the worst-case scenario, if the gap was large enough, one would find themselves grinded into meat paste. In fact, one of the actions of the Emperor's Seal was known as rotation. With every rotation, the pressure would increase on the person beneath the seals might until they could no longer handle it and exploded. Lionel took another step forward and touched yet another bubble. Emperor's Edict. As these runes fused with Lionel, his aura became more refined and more dignified. The rotating runes within his irises only grew more complex with every assimilation. Emperor's Edict was yet another technique that Lionel found very similar, and once again, he gained an entirely new view of it. This technique wasn't very different from the one his mother created. It used Emperor's Seal to form the boundaries of a world, and then it disseminated an Emperor's Edict. This edict set a rule that had to be followed within the confines of the Emperor's Seal's world. If this sounded familiar, that was because it was. It was the very same concept as Lionel's mother's Crystal World technique, one that Lionel hadn't used in a very long time because he simply didn't have the time to assign to mastering it. This technique, when fully mastered, could be extraordinarily powerful. Lionel could set a rule that stated that all metal within his seal world were brittle. In this situation, if a sword tried to attack him, he could shatter it with the flick of a single finger. If he was in a world of water and found himself disadvantaged by the terrain, he could set a rule that stated all water would vanish, and suddenly he would be fighting in the air. He could reverse gravity, he could zap away all oxygen, he could even turn all gas in the air into an extremely flammable substance, and then light it all on fire with a single thought. When taken to its logical extreme, Emperor's Edict, or Lionel's mother's Crystal World technique were all mind-numbingly powerful, and in the hands of someone like Lionel, the possibilities were simply endless. In the face of an emperor, what right did anyone have to resist? Chapter 1734. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:06 and 14 seconds AM Chapter 1734. Emperor's command: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled a breath. Despite the nourishment, he could vaguely feel that he was reaching his limit. He didn't actually believe that the problem was that his soul wasn't strong enough. It was more so that his body wasn't in the best condition right now. Although his soul had been replenished to its peak, a lot of its strength was being diverted to keep his body up and running. If he used up too much of his capacity, his body, which was already barely holding on by a single line, could very well reach past a point of no return. Lionel sighed. He really wanted to absorb more. After a moment, he utilized instant recovery in the outside world, allowing his body to recover somewhat. Although he was still as skinny as a beanpole, at the very least, his life was no longer in any real danger. Lionel scanned through the bubbles and locked eyes on the radiant blue ones. They were much larger and more vibrant than the green ones that he had been working with until now, and his curiosity was really getting the better of him. If the bottom 5 methods of this Emperor's Might tablet were already so powerful, what exactly did these behemoths represent? What techniques were they hiding? Lionel let his curiosity get the best of him. Until his body truly recovered. This would be the last bubble he would clear for a while. In addition, if his choice was one of the much larger blue ones, then it was likely that even after his body recovered, he would have to wait until he progressed through a few tiers and strengthened his soul before he came back again. But Lionel felt that if the bottom 5 techniques were already so powerful, he felt that the top few would likely be life-changing. Lionel took a breath and pushed the other bubbles out of the way with his thoughts, reaching forward toward one of the largest radiant blue bubbles. Up above the rest of them, there were 3 bubbles of the exact same size, all of them exuding a blinding royal blue light. Lionel had no way of choosing between them, so he just picked one at random, reaching his hand forward and popping it. The strong surge of pressure made Lionel shudder. On the one hand, he felt as though his soul and body were being ripped apart, but on the other hand, he was being built back up just as fast. He could feel his capacity for dream force increasing by leaps and bounds. Strong waves of auspicious air were exuding from him in tsunami-like currents, and his aura was becoming suffocating. Deep within his eyes, a blinding blue light shone, so bright in fact that the runes within it were nowhere to be seen. Only Lionel could feel these runes, each one of them countless times more complex than any he had ever seen. Just when Lionel felt that he had reached his limits, his 3 Dream Force stars began to slowly rotate, their pinnacle 7th-dimensional star runes shining and offsetting the pressure. It seemed that it was only because he had reached this state with his Dream Force that he was able to withstand the pressure. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. As the technique and Lionel's star runes formed a sort of feedback loop between one another, Lionel felt that his understanding of Dream Force and the soul was becoming clearer and more defined. In fact, he felt that the path ahead to taking the first step on his journey of Dream Force manipulation was becoming just that small bit brighter. Several moments later, the process finally came to a stop and Lionel gasped for air. However, even after a long while, the blue radiance coming from his eyes was only slowly fading. Lionel stood in silence for a long time, not quite knowing how to take this technique or to accept what he was feeling. What was life exactly? Had he really been overthinking it all this time? Was it really that all life was equally valuable? Or was it more accurate to say that all life was equally worthless? Emperor's command, arise. Using this technique, Lionel could target a recently deceased individual's soul. He could give it shape and form, using it to fight on his behalf and as a proxy for his other techniques. However, this was only the simplest use of this technique. On the more complex side of things, he could assimilate the affinities of this individual through the use of Emperor's presence. Much like he did with his forces when he formed sovereignty, he could form a sovereignty through this deceased individual's soul. For example, if Lionel killed a master of the wind element, and then took control of their soul before it dispersed, he could gain sovereignty over the wind element through the use of this soul's affinity. In fact, he would be able to command this soul to use the abilities they had in their lifetimes with even greater ease and power than the person themselves had when they were living, just by virtue of the fact he could give them sovereignty. To say that this ability was overpowered was an understatement. In fact, Lionel felt that it was more than worthy of being one of the 3 absolute strongest abilities of the Emperor's Might tablet, even if it was only for temporary usage. But it still left him feeling a bit conflicted. When Lionel first learned that he could revive the dead through the use of the silver tablet, he had his own small existential crisis back then. He felt that his worldviews were spinning in his head and he didn't know how to reconcile it all. However, he had been able to eventually shrug it off because the power was in the hands of a treasure far beyond his imagination. Maybe it was only right that it could do such a thing. But what could he say now that such a technique was at his fingertips? Now that he too could play with life and death with just a thought? How could he reconcile this matter? What left Lionel the most silent, though, was that there were still 2 other techniques of this caliber within the tablet. In fact, they were connected with this one, so much so that he already knew their names. Emperor's Command, Assimilate. Emperor's Command, Breathe. Lionel didn't know the details of these techniques, but just by virtue of their names he had a few guesses. And if he was correct, Lionel closed his eyes, releasing a sigh. However, not long later his eyes snapped open. Hoo! Bang! The flagship shuddered as something collided against it. Chapter 1735. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:06 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1735. Pirates. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's eyes snapped open immediately. Aina sat on her knees nearby. She had already looked off into the distance, but it was difficult to see anything from this location. This room didn't have any mirrors, and although there were monitors around to observe the situation outside, none of them had been turned on. Considering what the 2 had been doing in this room, they didn't have time to care about such things. Lionel tried to sit up, but an aching pain took hold of his body, threatening to make his consciousness fade. If it wasn't for the fact he had used instant recovery once already, he might have directly passed out just now. Aina looked back in panic slightly. It's fine, I can handle it. Lionel chuckled lightly and winced as he slowly pushed himself up. You don't even know what's going on outside. How could you say that so confidently? Seeing that Lionel was in the mood to joke around, Aina rolled her eyes. If this man didn't look like he was at death's door, she would really teach him a lesson. Lionel's pale violet hair and irises had lost all of their color, both looking far more like a pale gray and lacking the vibrancy they had once had before. He was still naked, so it was all too easy to see his skin sticking loosely to his bone. His cheeks were sunken and the bags under his eyes were practically black. At a glance, he looked like a talking zombie with a small dash of handsomeness, probably only Aina could see with her love-tinted glasses. That said, Lionel wasn't wrong. To say that the warship with the size of a moon was actually a bit of an underestimation of its size. Without the monitors activated, Aina's mind, even with its recent buffs, had no way of seeing far enough to check on what was going on outside. Bang! The warship shudders again as Lionel just barely managed to push himself up. Even so, it's too dangerous for you to go. Your instant recovery didn't even work this time. At least absorb some of the demon corpses first. Lionel shook his head. It'll be fine. There's no need to waste the demon corpses on this. We only have a limited number of them, and they're best used to help everyone else. Don't worry too much. I might look like I have a foot in the grave, but right now, I'm actually more powerful than I've ever been before. Lionel stood to his feet, wobbling once before he regained his bearings. He slapped his thighs once and a pair of sweatpants covered him up. He couldn't be bothered to dress the rest of himself. I'll go see who's ruining our honeymoon. Aina blushed slightly when she heard this. This man had no tact. Outside the flagship, a fleet of spaceships surrounded the region, a number that could only be counted in the dozens and very close to bordering on the hundreds. These ships were only a fraction the size of the flagship behemoth, but they all had their cannons trained upon the same location, clearly planning to overwhelm quality with quantity and blast a hole through the hull of the warship. Not long after the second barrage rocked the flagship, Lionel and Aina appeared at the bow of the warship. Neither of them looked as though they were taking this matter seriously. Lionel wasn't even wearing a shirt, while Aina looked as though the only thing she was wearing was a shirt, having stolen Lionel's since he refused to give her time to prepare. Lionel had tried to tell her that he would handle things, but she refused given his state. In the end, she rushed after him like this, leaving him more than a little amused, and another much larger part aroused. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to entertain the latter. Lionel narrowed his eyes and looked at these ships. He had yet to activate the force field of the flagship, although doing so would have ended this farce. He was more interested in who exactly was attacking him. After a moment of observation, he was speechless. Were these pirates? The ships looked as though they were cobbled together from scrap metal, barely weathering the astral winds of deep space. Although the flagship had been surrounded, in reality the just over 100 or so spaceships had only covered a small range, or else concentrating their fire would have been obvious. What confused Lionel was what gave these people the balls to do this. Were they blind? Or were they led by an outright idiot? There was one thing Lionel's intelligence couldn't account for, and that was outright fools. How could you deduce what someone who had been dropped on their head as a baby would do? As Lionel was trying to understand what was happening, there was a subtle ripple that spread from a ship hidden in the center of the semicircular formation. A signal. Lionel understood immediately. The spaceships geared up once more, their cannons glowing with a radiant light as they aimed forward once again. Something is off. A ripple spread from Lionel. All around the flagship, his clones appeared once again. In just a small instant, the force field activated. The beams of light converged, colliding against a recently formed barrier. However, this time the flagship didn't so much as quake. In fact, the force field didn't even so much as ripple. As though it had met a perfectly reflective surface, the beams of light reflected back. Before the spaceships could even react, they were enveloped by a blinding light. By the time Lionel's vision cleared, even his lip could only twitch. The entire fleet was eradicated in a single blow. No, not the entire fleet. There was just one straggling junkyard ship near the edge that just barely managed to stay outside of the range. But when Lionel's gaze zoomed onto their location, he found that the pilot was practically shitting his pants. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He could smell the bullshit in the air, and it definitely wasn't coming from that pilot. At that instant, almost on cue, space warped and shuddered. As though they had just stepped out of a hyperdrive state, 6 new ships appeared in an instant. This time, however, they truly did surround the flagship. With a length of several hundred kilometers each, they were just barely large enough to do so as well. Chapter 1736. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:06 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1736. Impervious ruler. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wondered if these people would be stupid enough to attack as well. Although their ships were much larger, they were still nowhere near comparable to the flagship. In fact, Lionel felt that he could act personally and take down these ships in a few minutes. The metal they used was mostly formed of 5th-dimensional ores, and they only used 6th-dimensional ores to reinforce it. This was probably the most common configuration of spaceship, since even for 7th-dimensional worlds, such a large amount of 6th-dimensional ore was too expensive to be gathered casually. Only the most elite of 7th-dimensional worlds would form warships so large with 6th-dimensional materials, and only true powerhouse organizations like Shield Cross Stars would be able to form such a large flagship like this one with majority 7th-dimensional materials. This was all to say that this fleet of 6 stood no chance. So Lionel really wanted to see what they were getting at here. It seems that they're targeting this ship, even to the point of luring me to kill that previous pirate fleet. But if they're targeting me, that has to mean that they know of me and my location enough to prepare this scheme, no matter how pathetic it is. But how could they know? No one should know where I am. If my location was leaked, these clowns wouldn't be the first to make it. It would most definitely be Shield Cross Stars, or any number of my other enemies. The more Lionel thought about it, the more foolish he thought these individuals were. If they knew who he was, they should know how valuable his head was. Why would they come personally instead of just selling this information? Unless, at that moment, in the central warship, a few figures stepped out to the bow. The edge of their ship was just about a kilometer from Lionel's own. At this distance, the ships could very well fall into each other's pull and crash, but their relative power structure stopped this from happening. There were exactly 3 figures, the middle of which was a gentleman wearing robes of white and purple. He seemed to be exceptionally refined, but anyone with any world experience could tell that he was putting up a false front. He deemed himself to be more important than he was. "My name is Richard. It's a pleasure to meet you, Lionel Morales. Although it's unfortunate that you've targeted my people like this, don't you think that your actions are a bit overboard?" Lionel's eyes narrowed. Those words made it quite clear that his location had been exposed. This truly made things more interesting. There definitely wasn't a tracking device in the flagship. Well, there was one, but Lionel had dealt with it long ago. He wasn't a fool. It was potentially possible that one could guess that he was headed to Earth and check the common routes that connected the 2 territories. Considering the specifics of space travel, if one wanted to get to a location without wasting literal centuries, there were only certain paths that you could take. These were so-called star lanes that allowed hyperspeed travel without worrying about riddling yourself with holes. However, it also had to be remembered that Lionel had gotten distracted and allowed his flagship to drift quite far off course. There was simply no way to find him using these obvious methods. Seeing that Lionel remained silent, Richard felt that he was now a point up, his smug smile increasing as he let the silence hang. In his mind, he was making the mighty Lionel Morales squirm, waiting to find out what his purpose was. After he was satisfied, Richard revealed a pleasantly self-satisfied smile. "I've come here for one purpose today. This flagship, I'll be confiscating it. It's the least my people deserve for their grievances." Richard's smile became brighter. Lionel didn't respond. He was still lost in thought, trying to figure out exactly what was going on. He had an idea of what might be happening, but the complexity was taking a while even for him to untangle, and the only time that happened was when he was lacking information. After a while, Lionel looked up. Richard was looking at him with the same smile, believing that Lionel realized he was cornered. Since they could find him once, it was just a matter of a single call, and half the human domain would be hunting him down. From time to time, Richard's gaze would shift toward Aina. Although Lionel's shirt was huge on Aina and covered more than enough, her current state was simply too enticing. It was simply a universal mating call to all men. But Richard, in trying to remain professional, only took a glance from time to time. Although he was being subtle, how sharp were Lionel's senses, exactly? "You know." Richard's smile began to grow brighter. "I really hate the name Richard." Richard's smile froze. "Every one of you guys I've run into seems to be more of a dumbass than the last." Lionel took a step forward, stepping onto the air. His body looked as though it could be blown over with a single gust of wind, and yet a stifling pressure rose, causing the surrounding ships to begin to whine and creak. Richard's expression changed as he took a step back, the 2 individuals who had followed him out stepping forward with menacing auras. Without fail, both of them were in the 7th dimension. However, Lionel continued to walk through the air as though he hadn't noticed at all, a billowing violet fog wafting from his body. He raised palm and faced it downward, causing a small rotating circle of violet wind beginning to spin around him. Emperor's gaze. With a flash, Lionel's irises blazed with a blinding light, enveloping the 2 7th-dimensional existences and Richard. Richard began to foam at the mouth and practically collapsed. The 2 7th-dimensional existences were only dazed for a moment and seemed prepared to break out of it in the next instant. But by then, the cyclone of violet expanding beneath Lionel's palm had expanded across the kilometer distance in the blink of an eye, shooting beyond until it crossed even 100-kilometer distance. Emperor's edict. No 7th-dimensional existences shall step into my domain. The dazed 7th-dimensional existences felt a suffocating might envelop them. Before they could even react, they were expelled over 100 kilometers away, and were completely incapable of reacting. With a step, Lionel's frail body landed on Richard's ship. However, at that moment he looked no different from an impervious ruler, one whose commands couldn't be denied. Chapter 1737. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 1737. Projectile. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Lionel reached out a palm and Richard flew into his palm. At that moment, Lionel's gaze glowed with a bright violet light. His gray hair even flickering with motes of purple light as well as it danced in the wind. Who sent you? Richard was completely out cold. The whites of his eyes rolled forward and his mouth frothed. However, the moment Lionel spoke, it was as though his mind had been struck with a bell, and his mouth began to move on its own. My father sent me. Who is your father? Lionel asked. My father is Patriarch Guerrero Zernan, the ruler of the chaotic water sector. Even in his state, there was a hint of pride in Richard's tone as though he still had a right to brag. The trouble was that he clearly hadn't noticed that this father of his had sent him on a death mission. Something told Lionel that it wasn't just the pirate fleet that was bait. Richard was probably bait as well. But what was more curious was that Lionel had never heard of this chaotic water sect. Considering they could send two seventh-dimensional beings along with Richard, Lionel would guess that they were at least at that level. If he had to pinpoint an exact level, he would guess that they were closing in on the middle rank of seventh-dimensional sectors, but weren't quite there yet. The reason was quite obvious. The two seventh-dimensional existences they had sent had broken through using the conventional path, and they probably weren't among the truly powerful individuals. In fact, they were far from it. In addition, Richard was the son of a ruler of a sector, and yet he didn't have a soul protection treasure on him. That was enough for Lionel to make some assumptions. Lionel went through his memories and finally found reference to the chaotic water sector. Interesting, his assumption had been correct. This sector was indeed a seventh-dimensional sector, but it was middling. Of course, to Lionel, who was used to dealing with the Constellation families, and was from the Morales family, his definition of middling was quite different from others. In truth, the chaotic water sector was definitely a region of powerhouses, and were about the same level of strength as Triana's Virer family. There wasn't anything special about their location at first glance, but if Lionel's deductions were correct, they were probably near the current borders of Earth. Last time Lionel had fought for Earth, it had been against the Umbra family and those other sixth-dimensional families, but by now, Earths had evolved twice and their territory was much larger. This meant that they were probably dealing with a lot of internal struggles right now, as Lionel was sure that they had yet to assimilate so much territory. Nor would the families and organizations that had once called those regions home obediently step aside. At the same time, they had new neighbors that watched what happened to the others, and didn't want to sit idly by as they too were swallowed up. The chaotic water sector was making a preemptive move, and they had even been so fast to move. It was clear they were waiting for an opportunity, but more importantly, they had a trump card capable of finding Lionel in the middle of nowhere. This was clearly a warning. There were only two ways that this could go. The first would be Lionel obediently bowing his head. This would allow the Ernan family to manipulate him from the shadows, and he could even be used to bolster their position. The second possibility was that Lionel would lash out, and the ultimate result would be the Ernan family using this as an excuse to attack with reason on their side. In normal times, such childish tricks wouldn't work, but with his mother forcing Shield Cross stars to retreat from their territory, the chaotic water sector could be more brazen with their actions. Lionel's lip curled. He tapped a foot and the metal beneath his bare feet rippled, curling up and forming a pole that he wrapped around Richard's ankle and hung him upside down. Stay here obediently, Lionel said casually, even though Richard was far too out of it to understand what he was saying. In the end, the supposed prince could only nod obediently. At that moment, there was a burst of activity from behind the thick metal doors leading to the bow of the ship. The doors blasted open, and a large number of soldiers holding what looked like assault rifles rushed forward. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Since when were guns a common weapon in the dimensional verse? Fire. Lionel was surprised again. These soldiers truly had no respect for their prince. Richard hung right behind him, yet they were opening fire with naked abandon. It was as though they didn't care about hitting Richard at all. Lionel's palm rose again, still facing down. Stop. With a whoosh, another circular formation of rotating violet fog spread outward, enveloping Lionel and the soldiers. The moment Lionel's commanding voice spread out, the bullets came to a grinding halt in the air. Lionel swept a casual gaze over them. realizing that these weren't normal metal casings at all, but rather seemed to be concentrated bullets of force. Lionel nodded. He raised a finger and flicked it outward. Reverse. The bullets that had stopped in their tracks suddenly shuttled back, toward the guns they had just come out of. Close. Lionel squeezed a hand, and the barrels of the assault rifles crumpled like cheap paper. In their panic, some of the soldiers tried to fire again, but that only made the situation worse. Bang, bang, bang. The guns exploded and backfired, causing catastrophic results. Lionel continued to walk forward as though the explosions didn't bother him in the slightest. Condense. The blast radius condensed into his palm, until the point it was no more than a tenth the size of a fingernail. He reached a hand out to the side, and aimed toward the warship floating several kilometers away to his right. Accelerate. Lionel flicked his finger, and the projectile zoomed forward with unprecedented speed. In the blink of an eye, it vanished into the hull of the spaceship and a silence fell. Boom. Chapter 1738. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1738. Petty tricks. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Even as the corpses fell in a pile of flesh and blood before Lionel, an entire warship collapsed to his right. All the while, the young man who caused it all only continued to leisurely stroll forward. Lionel reached out a hand, and a gun that managed to survive flew into his hands from the arms of an injured soldier. He balanced it in his hands for a moment, scanning it with dream sculpt in the fraction of a breath. This isn't made by Earth, it seems to be a copy. Is Earth using guns to fight and others chose to copy? Considering the fast reaction of this Guerrero's individual, he seems to be quite the innovative and clever type. In that case, it's not impossible. Lionel walked forward, stepping over the piles of flesh and blood. He casually raised the gun, firing a few times. He seemed to be quite aimless in his aiming, shooting through doors, walls, ceilings and even floors. However, if one had X-ray vision, it would only take a moment to see that he was actually piercing the forehead of an individual with each shot. The commotion of the blast caused a large number of soldiers to rush to the bow of the ship to see what was happening, but most died even as they made their way to the location, not even making it to the hallway to see the face of the man that was killing them. Just seconds later, Lionel walked out from the ship with a casual expression on his face. He looked up as two powerful auras surged toward him, but he looked back again as though thinking about something. He picked up the makeshift pole he was using to hold up Richard, and tossed him across the kilometer space between the ship and flagship. Just as he finished, the two seventh-dimensional existences came roaring back, both of them sporting ugly expressions. They could sense that one of their warships had been entirely slaughtered, while a second had not only been slaughtered, but it even exploded as well. They roared in fury, striking out with their palms at the same time. 3, 2. Lionel looked up again and stepped off of the warship, falling through the vastness of space. 1. Boom. The expressions of the seventh-dimensional existences changed. Flying was only something those with a certain control over God runes could accomplish. In addition, such individuals tended to be very deep into the seventh dimension as well. It simply wasn't possible for them who had broken through using the conventional page. Due to this, it had taken them a long amount of time to return, because they had practically been swimming through the vastness of space. They hadn't come prepared to do that and as such, could only wastefully use their force-like propulsion engines to make their way back here. A process that was obviously much slower than their usual speed. However, now that they had just made their way back, they found themselves caught up in a violent storm. Although this explosion couldn't do much to them outside of leaving some minor flesh wounds, what it could do was send them flying into the distance again. Lionel used the explosion to flutter back to the flagship, landing on the bow lightly as he watched on in amusement. This Hernan family wanted to send him bait? Sure, he would eat as much bait as they could stomach to give up. He would eat until they were sick of it, and had to expose the true existences behind this. Lionel didn't believe for a single second that a family on the same level as the Vierer family would dare to do all of this, even if they seemingly had enough motive to do so. If Guerreros knew that Lionel had been hunted down, Information that wasn't very widespread as of yet, especially since disciples weren't allowed to leave Void Palace. Then he should also know who the princess of the Ascension Empire was, and likewise who her husband was. The fact he still dared to do all of this just for the pretext to attack Earth was fishy. Bang. Bang. At that moment, the palm strikes of the two seventh-dimensional experts finally landed, but they were just as quickly snuffed out by the force field barrier. 2 down, for more to go. Lionel smiled, ready to lift off again and crush the 4 remaining warships. Aina, who still stood on the bow of the ship as well, her arms crossed about her chest, shook her head. This man was having a little bit too much fun without her. Patriarch, there's been news. In a simply dining room, far more simple than one would expect the ruler of a sector to be found eating in, a middle-aged man with streaks of white in his dark hair sat. He wore familiar white and purple robes, and he ate with pristine etiquette. There's no need to report something so obvious. They used the flagship to destroy the fleet, correct? Send the envoys to the Ascension Empire, and demand an explanation. Don't come to me for something so trivial. Guerrero slowly looked up from his meal. What is it? Gabian and Seath have sent a message. Graysos frowned. That didn't make any sense. If they used the flagship, Gabian and Seath, the 2 seventh-dimensional existences he had sent with his useless son, should have long since been dead. Seventh-dimensional experts of the conventional path had no method to deal with a Tier 2 star rank flagship. In truth, seventh-dimensional experts could only be classified as rare if they were on the God path. Conventional path seventh-dimensional experts could be found in large numbers in any empire, organization or family worth their salt. The conventional path was only a repeat of the first 3 dimensions to begin with. As long as a territory was of a certain standard, it was only a matter of time and resources to raise someone to the 7th dimension. However, it was also because of this that they were ultimately less valuable and also far less powerful. Of course, this wasn't to say that they were weak, or else Lionel wouldn't have used such underhanded tricks to deal with them while also letting them leave alive. There was still a substantial and qualitative difference between the 6th and 7th dimensions no matter the path taken. This was to say that in Grayso's estimation, Lionel wouldn't dare to fight those 2 head-on, and would just rely on the flagship to sweep them. But if they lived, what did that mean? Did Gabian and Seath desert the army and flee ahead of time? Seeing Guerrero's expression, the envoy didn't dare to delay any further, and explained everything without holding back. The more Guerreros listened, the more serious his expression seemed to become. In the end, he fell into a long silence. It seemed that he had underestimated this Lionel far too much, to think that he didn't make use of the flagship. It could be said that Lionel only halfway fell into his trap, but this was still enough. All that mattered was that Lionel still wasn't strong enough to face 7th dimensional existences. All he could use were petty tricks. Chapter 1739. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1739. Fists of Love. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood somewhat weakly before the upside Richard. The latter was still frothing at the mouth and obediently answering Lionel's questions, but it was unfortunate that this fool had no useful information. It was more likely that one of the foot soldiers that had come with him would know more about the inner workings of the chaotic water sector than this supposed prince would. After a while, Lionel shook his head and directly killed him, turning him to ashes. He didn't have the patience to keep this person around, and he also felt that it was unfair if this incompetent prince got to survive after so many of his subjects died due to this very incompetence. Are you finally done? Come and eat, then. You look like death, Aina said. Lionel wanted to resist after Aina grabbed his hand, but he found himself too weak to do anything. The world spun and he ended up on her back, speechless. Can't you carry me in a more comfortable position? I'm finding it hard to believe that you're actually worried about me. Lionel dangled like a sack of potatoes, nursing grievances. Oh, you know about comfortable positions too? Aina replied with a more sinister edge to her voice. Hee hee. Lionel laughed and then coughed. What did you want me to do? You were gripping the sheets so hard that I couldn't move you even if I wanted to. What did you say? Why don't you speak a little louder? Lionel coughed, feeling Anna's shoulder digging into his gut. What was that? The wind just now was really loud. Humph. Anna's face flushed red. She knew that her display was really embarrassing back then, but she couldn't help it. Men had bodies that gave them a break once they hit one climax, but women's bodies didn't work exactly the same. Her body in particular had a really high rate of recovery even in comparison to other women, and Lionel knew how to use his dream world to take advantage of her. She couldn't even remember what happened after a certain point. Her mind had been entirely fried. The novel stimulation was too much, just thinking about it. Anna's face only became redder before she grit her teeth. If it wasn't for the current state of Lionel's body, she would definitely get her revenge immediately. As for any soreness, her body had recovered a long time ago. Lionel finally couldn't hold it in and burst into a fit of laughter. He laughed so hard he could feel what remained of the fragile fibers of his muscles shredding into pieces. But even so, he couldn't stop. Anna plopped Lionel down on a dining room chair and gave him a glare before scurrying off into the kitchen. Even now, this man refused to stop laughing. He was very lucky that he was so injured right. After a while, Lionel finally managed to stop wheezing. At the moment, the two of them had entered the segmented cube. With its current level, the segmented cube was still separated into lab setting and abode setting. However, the change was that the latter was now separated into an estate setting and a world setting. The former carried the typical home, rooms and board that Lionel and Anna were used to, while the latter was, as its name denoted, feeling a lot more like a small planet. The world setting was primed to grow a large amount of resources. It only needed Lionel's guidance. Although Lionel hadn't experienced it, the segmented cube had experienced a very long period of time, and, as such, had a ton of accumulated energy ready to be released. As for the estate setting, it was probably more luxurious than any home Lionel had ever seen. This was just one of the many kitchens, but it felt as high-tech as the flagship that was waiting on them outside. Lionel smiled lightly as watched Anna bring out a large amount of ingredients. It was only 10 minutes in before he began to smell an intoxicating fragrance. Yip, yip. With a flash, little Black Star appeared in a swirling ball of darkness, landing on a chair by Lionel and hanging out his little pink tongue. It had been too long since the little guy tasted Anna's cooking, so the moment he smelt something, he came immediately, unwilling to waste even a single moment. Lionel laughed and rubbed the little mink's head before his head suddenly turned in a certain direction. What are you two hiding for? You might as well come. I don't mind sharing a bit of my wife's cooking with you all. Lionel's words had hardly come out when a ladle streaked over like an arrow and rebounded against his head. Vice and Candle, who had been peeking in from the outside, were stunned for a moment before looking toward one another. Candle covered her mouth, stifling a hint of a laugh. As for Vice, his face was just as much of a brick wall as it was always, but Lionel could see the twitch in his lip. Lionel rubbed forehead with one hand before beckoning with the other. His attempt to remain dignified and kingly completely fell through with the growing lump on his forehead. Don't mind her, her temper is fiery, but her cooking is excellent. Lionel ducked after finishing these words, just barely making it out of the way of another flying spoon. With a grin he pushed out 2 chairs for Vice and Candle even as Anna came out with the first dish. I don't see a wedding ring, who's your wife? Anna asked with a glare before putting down the food before Vice and Candle as though Lionel didn't exist. Yip, yip. Yes, yes, Black Star, I have some good food for you too, Anna smiled. I just have to find your old man first, Lionel beamed. Hearing this, Anna looked away from Black Star and gave Lionel a weird look. Last time he and her old man had met, Lionel cracked more than just a couple ribs. What's with that look? His love language is just his fists, I'll be fine. Anna sputtered with laughter beside herself. Chapter 1740. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 1740. Fury. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Earth seemed even more gorgeous from above than it ever had been before. Swirls of white clouds, rushes of blue oceans, endless expanses of greenery. It wasn't as fanciful as some other planets, but it was perfect in its simplicity, at least for the most part. There was one part of the blue-green planet that wasn't different from the rest, and that was a singular tree so large that it was visible even from the depths of space, the very same ascension tree where the core of the empire lay. Last time Lionel had seen it, it was barely the height of a tall skyscraper. But now it made mountains seem small and insignificant. If not for the terraforming technology of Earth, even the moon's orbit would be interrupted by it. The appearance of the flagship within Earth's territory was enough to cause a large stir. How could a ship the size of a moon not have such an impact? However, when the various checkpoints showed the somewhat frail Lionel standing at the bow, and felt the familiar aura of the Fox family, there were very few that dared to stop him. Lionel should have been beaming on his return home, but the things that he had seen on his way here left his expression frighteningly cold, so cold that many who hadn't dared to stop him didn't do so directly out of fear. They only reported this to the higher-ups. This led to an odd situation where some let Lionel go because they recognized him, but others simply hadn't been able to build up the courage to do so. This was odd indeed. Although Lionel had recovered somewhat, he still looked frail and skinny. His current Bodhi's strength was maybe 30% of what it should be at his peak, but even so, most couldn't bear to look him in the eye. When Lionel crossed the final checkpoint and entered Earth's solar system, he wasn't only greeted by the sight of Earth, but he also found several vessels rising into the air. Lionel's gaze flashed. Upon these vessels, there were a large number of red hair and red-eyed individuals. It took only a single instant for Lionel to recognize them. Halt! Powerful auras descended from all sides. Lionel remained silent for a moment, his flagship continuing to move forward, with its force field. Even seventh-dimensional experts shouldn't be able to do a single thing to him, logically. Even if Earth managed to give birth to such experts in his absence, they shouldn't be a threat to him. However, Lionel simply had too many questions about the origins of the Brazinger family, and those three other mysterious families, especially after seeing traces of them in the zone. Due to this, Lionel didn't dare to make assumptions about what strength they did or didn't have. But regardless of that, the Brazinger family was Aina's enemy, so they were his enemy. And yet, they wanted to try and flex their authority in his territory. The fury Lionel had been feeling up until this point bubbled past the point of no return, and his chest expanded with a puff of air. Scram! Powerful waves of force billowed out from Lionel's roar, causing the several vessels before him to quake and rupture, a violent resonance forcing their structural integrities to collapse one after another. Lionel's roar was so loud that the whole of Earth heard it, the clouds shuddering and many even dispersing. Without another word, Lionel continued to urge the flagship forward before placing it outside of Earth's orbit. At this moment, everyone noticed the shadow of another moon-sized object in the skies, but they could only look up, their eyes widened in shock. Lionel flipped over a palm and casually took out a treasure he had created in the last few days. It was a surfboard constructed entirely of a pitch black ore and exuding a menacing sort of aura. He leapt forward, landing on it before zipping forward. Yip! Black Star flashed and landed on Lionel's shoulder as he zipped through the skies, crossing through the depths of space and entering Earth's atmosphere like a speeding comet. It didn't take Lionel long at all to appear in the Ascension Empire's capital and fall heavily before the steps of the palace. Almost immediately, just like the last time he had come here, dozens of golden armored guards pointed their spears forward, their auras towering into the skies. However, compared to last time, there wasn't a single individual here who wasn't at least in the sixth dimension. In fact, those of the sixth dimension were also the ones with the sharpest auras. The others were all of the seventh dimension. It was clear to Lionel at first glance that the sixth-dimensional experts had all entered into this realm with the God Path, or at the very least, a path that seemed equally as potent. As for the others, they had been raised to the seventh dimension through the use of a great amount of resources. Even so, when Lionel appeared, his own aura suffocated theirs. He wasn't in the mood to deal with this right now. Old Man Fox, get out here. Lionel's was far more concentrated than it was last time, and didn't spread throughout the entire planet. However, in its concentration it was far louder to those who did hear. rattling their eardrums and threatening to shatter their hearts. The forcefulness nearly blew the doors of the palace off its hinges. Bang! Bang! The tall doors swung open, several protective formations shattering to pieces as their weaknesses were seen through by Lionel in a single glance. At that moment, the protectors of the palace didn't say anything superfluous, attacking immediately. Lionel's hand palm opened up, facing the ground. A swirl of violet took form and in an instant, he had vanished from his location, appearing deep within the palace in the blink of an eye. Lionel appeared before another heavy set of bronze doors and kicked outward. Bang! At that moment, a large chorus of voices came to a grinding halt. The imperial court of the Ascension Empire fell into an eerie silence. Chapter 1741. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1741. Set up. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The appearance of Lionel caught the imperial court minister completely off guard. The sounds in this place were entirely isolated for the sake of privacy and safety, so none of them had even heard Lionel's earlier roars. Who? The ministers all looked toward Lionel at the exact same time. There were many old faces amongst the crowd, but still too few of them had seen Lionel personally. Well, more accurately, they had all seen Lionel personally, but the circumstances between then and now made it difficult to draw the connection. Back then, when Shield Cross stars projected Lionel's face all across, he was still a teen and he looked a lot different. His hair was bronze and his eyes were a pale green, plus he wasn't so malnourished as he looked now. Only those intimately familiar with him would actually recognize him. Up ahead, on the throne reserved for the Emperor, Old Man Fox sat with an indifferent expression. Despite the surprise, he didn't seem to react to Lionel's appearance at all. He simply looked toward his grandson with a neutral expression. To his side, Lionel's grandmother was actually present as well. Compared to her husband, she was much more pleasantly surprised. She didn't seem to care that Lionel had appeared in a rage at all, and only cared that he had appeared. The two of them actually looked a great deal younger. Last time Lionel had seen his grandfather, he looked well into his 50s, albeit younger than he had originally been. As for his grandmother, she looked like she wasn't long for the grave. However, after over 2 decades, the two looked like they had returned to their 30s. It was quite baffling until, that is, Lionel realized that the two of them had entered the 7th dimension. There was a hint of haziness over his grandfather, though, almost as though this was just what he was willing to show. The real oddity was that this was the first time Lionel had ever gotten an inkling about what level his grandfather was at. He always seemed unfathomable, even slapping an entire warship out of the skies with a single palm back then. The ones who had roared surged toward Lionel while the guards behind him were quickly catching up. But then Lionel spoke as though he hadn't sensed them at all. "Old man, what the hell are you doing? Are you trying to run this empire into the ground?" Hearing these words, Empress Fox blinked and realized that Lionel didn't look very happy. Only then did she settle down her maternal instincts and exhale a breath. Even so, just because she had always felt guilty toward Lionel, she would stand on his side if there was an opportunity. But for now, she chose to remain silent and hear what her grandson had to say. Emperor Fox looked toward Lionel, meeting his gaze with his own shimmering irises. He could sense that the Emperor's might aura coming from Lionel now was far more prominent than it ever had been in the past. In fact, it felt so potent that even given the frailty of his body, Lionel still looked like a towering mountain. "Brat, you've disappeared for 2 decades and came back with the cheek to berate your grandfather?" Hearing these words, those that were ready to deal with Lionel froze. To the side, Lionel's uncle coughed awkwardly, pushing up his glasses. He was really helpless to deal with the interactions between this pair of grandfather and grandson. "Don't patronize me, old man. On just a single trip here, I ran into at least 3 separate gangs, and that was just near the outer regions. By the time I entered the sector, there was some bullshit Ahorn family and Thrusting Skies organization that blocked my path, asking me for toll fees. When I entered the galaxy, a group of monks of the Evergreen Goddess and the Zoltine faith tried to have me give offerings for their cause. I finally got the quadrant, only for the Force Crafting Guild to try to confiscate my ship, because I apparently must have stolen it from them. Then when I finally made it to our solar system and I thought the bullshit was finished, the Brazinger family dared to stand in my path. You tell me, are you running this empire into the ground or not? Why is there not a single level or range within this territory that's safe from bullshit? I bet if I walked around Earth for a little while someone would try to rob me at gunpoint. What have you been doing for the last 20 years? Sitting on your thumbs? The ministers opened and closed their mouths for a long while, not knowing what to say. Many of them flushed with shame, but even more of them were surprised. They had never seen anyone speak to Emperor Fox in this way, not even his own son and grandson. Both Lionel's uncle and Noah were entirely too respectful to even breathe too loudly in the face of Fox. And yet here was Lionel. Despite the words, Emperor Fox didn't seem to react too violently. "Don't we have you to thank for this?" Emperor Fox replied, his lips spreading into a smile that carried with it a hint of deviousness. Lionel's gaze only flickered for a moment before his temper flared up again. "My fault. If you lost control of the situation to this extent just because Shield Cross Stars has been away for a few days, you really were sitting on your ass for the last 2 decades. If you need a corrupt organization like that to maintain control, you've been wasting your time. And even if it was my fault, so what? Aren't you supposed to be my grandfather? Where's your heroic spirit? Shouldn't you be protecting me from wind and rain? But you can't even protect your own empire. At this point you might as well hand over the reins to me. What the hell have you been doing?" As Lionel spoke, Emperor Fox's smile only grew brighter, and he even began to stroke his beard and nod his head. "Indeed, indeed." Emperor Fox nodded. "It's settled then. Prince Lionel will become the head of Earth's police force." With a flick of wrist, something soared through the air toward Lionel. The latter subconsciously caught it, only to look down and find a badge. Almost the instant Lionel touched it, the badge began to vibrate. "Trouble in the 3-pillar sector. Remnants of the Viola family are. Alert from Thrusting Skies sector. They're trying to expand again. Requesting reinforcements. The Zoltine faith is gathering offerings to build another shrine." Lionel's lip twitched. He felt like he had been set up. Chapter 1742. Published at 10th of April, 2023. 11:05 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1742. Network. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel shook his head speechlessly. He could tell that this old man was trying to take advantage of him again. But what else was new? First it was the war against terrain. Then it was the expansion war that took place after Earth entered the 5th dimension. And now this. It made him wonder how Earth ever managed to survive without him at all. He had only had the badge for a few seconds, but he was already swamped with work. He hadn't even properly recovered yet. Also, did they not see how sickly he looked? Where was the justice in all of this? In the end though, Lionel still put the badge away and turned to leave. "Don't blame me for my methods then," Lionel said on his way out. Emperor Fox chuckled in his heart. "My only worry is that you won't be wild enough." Even though he thought this, he didn't say it out loud. Empress Fox sighed. Although she was aware that her relationship with Lionel wasn't very close, she still found it unfortunate. He had hardly looked at her despite the fact they hadn't seen each other in over 20 years in her eyes. "Oh, right." Lionel turned back. "Grandma, this man is very shameless. If you bullies you be sure to call me so I can teach him a lesson. He's apparently got too much free time on his hands since he wants to run my empire into the ground." The Empress was shocked speechless for a moment before she sputtered with laughter. Her gaze filled with a doting and loving expression. Even after just a few seconds, Lionel could tell that his grandparents' relationship was a lot different than his own with Aina's, or even that of his parents. Their past should also be quite complex considering how long they had spent separated. Simply put, his grandmother didn't have very sturdy reins on this old man, so it was best that he tightened them for her. For the first time, Emperor Fox's expression flickered with a peculiar light. It was fleeting and almost impossible to pick up on, but the moment Lionel saw it, he grinned wildly. It had been a long time, but he had finally found it, the old man's weakness. Lionel turned back toward the palace's exit, raising his head in laughter. He would have quite some fun pressing down on this weakness in the future. It was too hard to deal with someone who had no shame. There was really only one method. To be even more shameless. The ministers fell into silence. For some reason, after Lionel's appearance, all of the tension had dissipated into thin air. Although the faces of the ministers were all new. They were all citizens of Earth. They were here when Lionel dropped a city on the capital and crushed the demigod that had stripped them all of their ability indexes and left them helpless in the face of terrain's experts. They had all been here when 3 sixth-dimensional galaxies attacked, and Lionel fought 6 sixth-dimensional experts alone while he had only been at the 5th dimension, crushing them one by one and then out-scheming them in the end. Even though 20 years had passed, and the legends had somewhat faded, if there was anyone who remembered it was them. Prince Lionel Morales had returned, and since he had, these matters could be considered to be settled. It was unknown just how much he had improved in his absence, but they suddenly felt a great amount of anticipation in finding out. Among the ministers, there was a gorgeous woman who sat in silence. This was none other than the former Secretary Marquisette Maya of the Royal Blue Province. However, now not only was her status high enough to sit within the imperial court, her position didn't seem to be normal even amongst the ministers as well. She watched Lionel's back disappear into the distance, her thoughts unknown. Lionel rubbed little Blackstar's head, lost in thought for a moment. He wasn't exactly sure of how to approach this just yet. He was just one person, and the burden was heavy. The obvious choice was to build up a cohort of people that he could trust, preferably one large enough to take up the former role of Shield Crossstars. But that would take too long. The people he could trust without a shadow of a doubt were far too few. This meant that Lionel's best choice was a small, speedy and tactical unit that could quickly cover the territory of Earth. Unfortunately, even the flagship at its greatest speed would take several hours to cross the 2 furthest points in Earth's territory. If Lionel wasn't fast enough, it would be a problem. Then that means that the only way is to set up a teleportation network. One that allows me to get anywhere within a few minutes. I could probably finish something like that within a week given that I have enough resources. Resources should be fine. I'll just steal from the old man. In these 2 decades, I'm sure that he's accumulated a large amount of wealth, especially with the current range of Earth's territory. In that case, the biggest problem with this approach will be that I won't have enough people to protect these teleportation networks. If others knew of Lionel's thoughts, they would be shocked into silence. If creating a teleportation network was so easy, it wouldn't only be the likes of the Void Palace that had such methods. In fact, even for the Void Palace, they didn't set up networks, but rather relied on high-class treasures they only handed to a select few individuals. This was how Lionel's mother had opened that wormhole-like portal back to the Void Palace. Lionel wanted to do something like this, but his ambitions were further beyond because unlike others, he could see through the limitations of the Void Palace system, and he wanted to fix them all. I need a map of Earth's territory, Lionel mumbled to himself as he turned back, entering the palace once again. The guards could only speechlessly watch him. Maybe only Lionel would so casually come in and out of the Ascension Empire's palace, as though he owned the place. Chapter 1743. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1743. Idiot? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What the fuck is this? Lionel stood in the palace's library, speechlessly going through star charts and not having any idea what to make of them. How could these even be called maps? They might as well have been scribbles. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. This is still alright. I'll just have to merge the knowledge I got from the Void Library with this. It won't be perfect, but Lionel shook his head and began to reconstruct the star charts in his dream world. He was fast and the process only took a few seconds. Although his body looked frail currently, his soul was like a blazing star at its core. His mind was even faster than it had been before, so much so that it didn't even make sense for him to count his number of split minds any longer, and his stamina felt endless. It was certain that this was a product of the cleansing brought through the Emperor's Might tablet. The largest changes occurring after he assimilated. Emperor's command. Arise. Definitely not perfect. I'd say that this is probably only about 60 to 70% accurate. Lionel's brow furrowed. The Void Library definitely wasn't the best place to get up-to-date maps. A much better place would probably be the Shield Cross Star's main branch. Although the Void Palace did have some basic information on sectors and galaxies, they tended to be quite out of date, lagging years behind. By now, the problem was obvious. The information the Void Palace had was from back when Earth was still in the third dimension. Since then, Earth had metamorphosized 4 times, and the surrounding territory had changed with it. Although the planets would mostly be in the same positions and such, it was hard to tell exactly which planets had shown the greatest potential, and were as such targets of larger populations, as they wouldn't necessarily be the planets that had started off as the most powerful. Back when Earth entered the 5th dimension, a whole host of new planets with great potential popped up. The ones with the greatest potential were classified as such and became priority locations to defend during the war. Since then, Earth had undergone 2 evolutions, and while Earth itself still had by far the greatest potential, there were countless other locations that were of great importance and were likely being fought over constantly. Without knowing exactly where these conflicts were, it would make it more difficult for Lionel to decide how to set up the network and make things run more smoothly. After a moment of thought, Lionel's gaze flashed and he thought of a solution. He flipped over his palm and his police badge appeared, flashing and vibrating all the while. With a thought, he sunk his mind into it, and as expected, he found a log of all the calls that had been made since the creation of the badge. He quickly sorted the calls by frequency and then by location. Afterward, he drew circles in his created spots across locations that could be considered hotbeds and ones that were cooler in area. When he was done, he had a systematic representation of where teleportation spots were most needed. Now he just needed exact locations. He had to choose locations for these teleportation spots that would be hard to find, or else if others wanted to cause trouble and destroy them before he could make use of them, that would be too troublesome. Luckily, the number of abandoned planets and moons far outstripped the number that was in active use. It was all too easy for Lionel to find such locations, and even set up measures to protect them. That should be enough. It's been a while since I've gone all out in crafting. This should be fun. In reality, it had only been a few weeks since Lionel constructed his new divine armors. It could only be said that he was quite addicted to crafting if these were still his thoughts. After leaving the library, Lionel looted the vaults of the Ascension Empire, taking far more than he needed without batting an eye. Then he found a random place and entered the segmented cube. Is everything okay? Lionel had only just entered when Aina's voice drifted to his ears. She had, of course, been there as Lionel was slowly losing his temper. She too was enraged. After all, Earth was also her home, so she was worried about it. It should be fine, but that old man suddenly gave us a ton of work the moment we got back. Aina raised an eyebrow. Us. Lionel turned toward Aina and grinned, scooping up her small waist in a single arm. Of course us. Haven't you ever heard of in sickness and in health? Aina rolled her eyes, pushing Lionel away. I still don't see a wedding ring. You've gotten too comfortable taking advantage of me. Lionel blinked innocently. Don't you like it when I take advantage of you? Aina's head snapped up, but by then, she only felt a light gust of wind as Lionel disappeared to the lab setting, the echo of his laughter leaving her quite helpless to do anything. Lionel worked fast, feeling the time crunch. Every time he sensed the badge buzz, he felt an added sense of urgency. He became mechanical in his movements, repeating the same actions again and again, but while his soul was exceptionally robust, the weakness of his body was lowering his finger designation, and his limbs were having a hard time keeping up. He pressed through it, trying to push past the plateau. Although he doubted that there was anyone who was being brazen enough to start massacres, the situation would only deteriorate from here. If he couldn't rein it in now, things would only become more troublesome in the future. Several hours in, Lionel was already exhausted and reaching his limits. What are you doing? Anastasia's voice sounded. Crafting. Lionel replied, too tired to be as annoyed as he should be by the stupid question. Are you an idiot? Anastasia answered. Chapter 1744. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1744. Short fuse. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel was indeed too tired to be annoyed initially, but when he heard Anastasia, he seemed to be slowly finding the energy. Didn't this floating lowly have anything better to do than berate him? He was trying to save lives here. I'm busy, Lionel responded. Busy being an idiot. You know you can use the lab setting to do all those repetitive tasks for you. This is the first time I've seen someone try to mass-produce something personally when they had access to so many machines. Lionel came to a stop and looked toward Anastasia. The latter only looked back at him with a face of disdain. If it wasn't because she was so focused on deducing a path through force manipulation that the majority could use, she would have stopped Lionel ages ago. You only need to craft it once and that thing will do the rest. Anastasia pointed with her head toward a glass chamber that had numerous spider-like arms of metal within. Lionel blinked once before doing as Anastasia said. Then he watched in absolute awe as the machine repeated his steps absolutely perfectly. At first he thought there would be a drop in quality. If there was one, it just wouldn't be worth it. However, he soon found that he had been overthinking things. Everything he had done, the machine did, even down to his precise control of force. Seeing this, Lionel exhaled a breath of relief. This was a game changer. He suddenly felt the need to look toward Anastasia. What other things are in here that I don't know about? Lionel asked. Anastasia sneered. Weren't you busy crafting? Lionel coughed lightly. Maybe he was just a bit too cranky. He couldn't help it though. His body felt like it was a gust of wind from keeling over. Also, he felt like a guillotine was looming over his head and ready to fall any time now. He really didn't want to waste even a second. Seemingly seeing Lionel's plight, Anastasia rolled her eyes and began to point things out one by one. Not even a few hours later, Lionel walked out of the lab setting with a spatial ring full of crafted items. With everything prepared even faster than he thought, his week-long prediction was cut down to just 3 days, something that made him grin despite his fatigue. You should rest, Aina said, looking up from her meditation. Lionel paused. Aina wasn't wrong, but he really didn't have the time to, but he luckily had a solution to this. It seemed that he had underestimated the segmented cube a bit too much, or more accurately, its abilities were so broken that he found it hard to believe that they all came in one package. He couldn't fathom the kind of existence that had created it. The suspended animation abilities of the segmented cube had evolved to not only stabilize energy and freeze time, but to increase its flow as well. It was an excellent method of healing up quickly. As long as Lionel went to sleep in one of the pods, he would gain himself several weeks of recovery time in just a few hours. But between that time he would need to eat. So he had come to his lovely wife again. Seeing Lionel's smile, Aina raised an eyebrow. I just need your help a little, Lionel smiled. After listening to Lionel's explanation, Aina was speechless but still waved her hand and agreed. It wasn't too big of a deal anyway. It was just a wasted day. Maybe only Lionel would be able to make her agree to such a thing. Lionel needed Aina to cook weeks' worth of meals to help him speed up his recovery. He would lie in the suspended animation pods for 15 or so minutes at a time, which would be worth about a day. He would then eat, and then return. Although Lionel could rely on the force of the segmented cube instead, between that and Aina's meals, the choice was obvious. The force pill quality of Aina's meals were far superior to just pumping himself with life force. Not only would he recover faster, but he would come back even stronger than before after putting his body through such a thing. As Lionel prepared, the chaos in Earth's territory only increased. But their day was coming. On day 2. Lionel rose out of the suspended animation pod for the final time, his skin glistening and his hair having returned to its previous shimmering luster. His muscles danced like intertwining steel cords beneath his bronzed skin, pulsing with vitality. Across from him, Aina, who was no small part fatigued, stood with his final meal. Lionel felt a dull ache in his heart when he saw her like this. Normal cooking was one thing. Aina could do that for months at a time without sweating a single bead of sweat, but force pill cooking was on a completely different level. Each meal required a large infusion of force, and Aina had been at it all day. It was no wonder she was so tired. "I'll handle the rest," Lionel said, embracing Aina into a hug. "You can rest for the next few days. I'll get everything set up." Aina nodded faintly, too tired to speak. Lionel soared out of the palace, his black surfboard surging with untold speed as he rushed forward. His sweatpants fluttered in the air, his chiseled torso cutting against the wind as he shot out of the atmosphere. However, to his surprise, there were a large number of Brazinger family members waiting in the skies above, leaving one hint annoyed and another part speechless. It had been an entire day since he came here. Could it be that they were waiting for him? After a while, Lionel realized that this wasn't the case. The Brazinger family members seemed to be patrolling? At that moment, Lionel's temper flared up again. He hadn't seen a single Brazinger family member during his journey to Earth, but he suddenly saw so many of them here. There wasn't a single person who would dare to attack Earth directly, as it would cross the bottom line of the powerhouse families, alliances and organizations of the human domain. Simply put, there was nothing to defend here. All of the issues were cropping up in the gray areas, regions that had been swallowed up by Earth's world spirit's range, but had been regions owned by others before. This was the region others could take advantage of under the pretext that it wasn't really Earth. Such regions would benefit from Earth's soon-to-be 8th dimension status and produce resources as such, so they were a hotbed for crime and schemes. And yet, instead of going there to show off their might, they were actually dancing around like clowns here. Lionel's short was exceptionally short recently, and this seemed to want to push him over the edge. Just when Lionel was about to do something, his gaze turned toward the moon. His fragmented Bao domain lineage factor activated, and he zoomed onto its surface, seeing through its details. The moon was a flourishing environment of green and blue, much like Earth. But when Lionel paid attention to what was actually happening on its surface, his heart threatened to erupt into a pool of lava. The moon people native to Earth were nowhere to be seen. In fact, he saw nothing but members of those 4 families. Chapter 1745. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1745. 2 possibilities if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in the skies for a long while, seemingly not even noticing the number of Brazinger family members slowly encircling him. Let alone that, he didn't seem to have taken care to mind the sheer number of them that had surrounded his flagship. By this point, they had given up on trying to make it on board and had settled for the next best thing, waiting for Lionel. As Lionel stood in the skies in silence, a ship just as silently approached, stopping just about 100 or so meters from him. Given the unique rules of space travel and warfare, this distance was actually very close and was about as close as most dared to come without having to worry about other variables. At that distance, it might as well have been the equivalent of someone standing nose to nose with Lionel on the ground. Lionel had slowly calmed from his initial rage-induced state. There were certain things that he had to be rational about. He didn't actually believe that his grandfather was so useless. This old man was someone even his father spoke of with respect, although this might be in part due to the influence of his mother. Knowing his father's personality, so long as Alienor wasn't within earshot, if he couldn't be bothered to care about Emperor Fox, he would say as much. In addition, even if he was wrong about all of this and his grandfather really was useless, just a few days ago his mother had threatened Shield Cross Stars into scramming out of their territory with just a single sentence. If the Brazinger family was as fragile as they seemed on the surface, they would have long since been weeded out. If not by his mother, then most definitely by his father. These were the thoughts that kept Lionel rational on the surface and helped him to have a modicum of patience. At the very least, his body wasn't in as poor a state as it was previously, so his fuse was just a bit longer. However, that didn't mean that he would explode any moment now. The spaceship came to a stop, with its size being just about 5 or 6 meters long. It wasn't very large at all. It reminded him a lot of a small yacht, just barely having enough space for some minor luxuries. At that moment, a man stepped out and looked toward Lionel. You are in the airspace of the Brazinger family. Who you are doesn't matter. Under the laws set by the Brazinger clan, you will be detained and your assets will be seized. The man clasped his hands behind his back, exuding a strong and mighty aura. For the first time, Lionel looked toward him. Indeed, there was something odd about the Brazinger family. The momentum of this man wasn't any lesser than a disciple of the Void Palace. In fact, his aura was slightly more robust than even Conan of the Leo family, and that was despite seemingly being only at tier 7, of course. This mattered little to the present Lionel, who had defeated Conan with hardly any effort, but it might matter for a future version of himself, especially considering the fact this man was tasked by the Brazinger family to basically be a glorified guard dog. Something wasn't exactly adding up. Lionel wasn't unfamiliar with the Brazinger family. In fact, he had a deep feud with one of their members, a spectacled young man by the name of Simeon. In truth, the two of them had met 3 times. One ended in a sort of Pyrrhic victory for Lionel, where he lost Aina for a span of several months, but both the second and third time, Lionel had directly suppressed him both times. From Lionel's understanding of the situation, Simeon had quite a high status amongst the Brazingers and his ability index was extremely powerful as well. Even beyond that, there was a time where Lionel had met 3 other young men of similar status to Simeon as well, and he had still been able to suppress them all. These matters happened back when Lionel had little understanding of his own personal strength and how to properly implement them. Although he couldn't be said to be perfect now, he was definitely far beyond anything he had been before. Even if his strength regressed back to the point it was back then, so long as he retained his current knowledge, to say that he would easily be at least 10 times stronger was actually a gross underestimation. This was all to say that Simeon hadn't been impressive at all. Of course, his ability index had a great amount of potential, and Lionel had even had thoughts of stealing it using the silver tablet and little black star, as it would be far better in his hands. But the ultimate truth was that Simeon wasn't all that impressive. So the question was, how could someone so clearly unimpressive have such a high status in a family that seemed so mysterious and could apparently afford to use such a talent as a patrol officer? There were only 2 possibilities. The first was that Simeon's status within the Brazinger family wasn't anywhere near as high as Lionel had previously assumed. The second possibility was that for one reason or another, Simeon was unable to display his true abilities. The second possibility wasn't impossible. It had to be remembered that Lionel's mother was similar in a lot of ways. She had spent a very long time in the 6th dimension, more than someone of her talent should. And this was all because Earth's evolutionary status had been a limiter for her. But the moment Earth broke free of the shackles of the 3rd dimension, her potential exploded forth all at once, and she became the legend she was today. So has something similar happened with the Brazinger family? But weren't they from Earth as well, so why was the effect so lagging? As Lionel was lost in his thoughts, the man before him seemed to finally realize that he was being overlooked. However, rather than being enraged, he simply raised a hand and pointed it forward. He would just take Lionel down first. Chapter 1746. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1746. Dead. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I'll give you one chance. Leave now or I'll kill every last one of you. Lionel suddenly spoke for the first time and a sudden vacuum seemed to form beneath his presence. Every single Brazinger family member suddenly felt that they had been locked onto as Lionel slowly took out his bow. He didn't seem to be in a hurry at all as he knocked a single arrow, closing his eyes as he hovered in the skies. The current state of Lionel's archery was greater than it ever had been before, and it was more than just because of his fragmented bow domain lineage factor, or even the improvements to his bow force. It was entirely due to the fact that he was won against using real arrows instead of force-forged arrows. In the past, Lionel couldn't justify spending hours to even days crafting arrows. At best, if he really cared, he might craft 1 or 2 that could be used in a pinch as an ultimate sort of trump card, but otherwise it was better to use bows that had an auxiliary effect of forming bow force arrows. This ultimately weakened his bowmanship somewhat. Many would assume that the bow was the more important part of an archer's arsenal, but there were many schools of thought that treated the arrow as an asset that was just as important. Lionel was of the belief that this was nonsense, but that didn't mean that he didn't understand the kind of deterrence and boost powerful arrows could have. It wasn't just a small boost either. His power as a bowman would easily double. It could only be said that the Brazinger family members who were still readying their charge had no idea what they were getting into. They didn't heed Lionel's words and they would suffer for it. The current Lionel didn't have to painstakingly craft every single arrow. He only had to forge a single one. And now, even while he wasn't paying any attention to it, the segmented cube was mass, producing arrows of top-tier quality at a rate he simply couldn't match. As Lionel raised his white lion bow, a resplendent white gold arrow trembled in his fingers, swirling with powerful strands of six-dimensional bow force. At that moment, the head patrol officer who had come to deal with Lionel felt his heart skip a beat. Let alone taking Lionel's words seriously, he hadn't even hesitated to move forward with the charge. The backline of spaceships were gearing up their cannons in case they were needed while the frontline spaceships all opened. A flood of patrol officers strapped with flying treasures soaring toward Lionel. However, the moment the head patrol officer met Lionel's cold gaze, a deep sense of regret gripped his heart. Twang! The arrow appeared before his forehead in the blink of an eye, accelerating not just once, but 3 times through the air. Every blast left devastating in its wake, sending shockwaves in all directions and even causing several patrol officers who got too close to its tailwind to explode into a rain of blood, gore and metallic pieces. PCHU. The head of the head patrol officer was pierced through by a hole so tiny and small that it wasn't noticeable at first glance. In fact, for the long while of silence that followed it, it didn't even bleed as though it wasn't there at all. But then, bang! The head patrol's officer's skull seemed to implode. In his final moments, his shock was etched onto his face, but he was entirely incapable of reacting. Just like that, a genius that could have made a name for himself in the Void Palace vanished from the world with a single arrow. By the time all of this had happened, though, Lionel had already knocked another arrow. Then another. To say that it was a massacre was an understatement. Lionel didn't even move a single step, nor did he seem to strain or struggle. Every arrow he released, no matter how hard their targets tried to dodge, seemed to end up right at the center of all of their forehead. Charge the cannons. Prepare to fire. The command structure of the Brazingers didn't collapse and another stepped in right away, relaying orders and barking out with their force to protect it. But as soon as they spoke, Lionel's arrow split their head open as well. Lionel flipped his palm and a radiant crimson arrow appeared, etched with ancient and oppressive runes. Even before it was knocked, the temperature of the surroundings seemed to skyrocket, almost as though the sun had suddenly moved an entire half the solar system closer. Die, he said lightly. Lionel knocked and released. The arrow appeared before a spaceship ready to fire in the blink of an eye. It tore through its hull as though it was made of aluminum, and then exploded. The skies about Earth and the moon turned blinded as a chain network of fireworks was set off one after another. Lionel didn't show the slightest hint of mercy. In fact, he destroyed their spaceship so thoroughly that even the bits and pieces that survived would burn to ash long before it could fall through Earth's atmosphere and hit the surface. Compared to the boy who struggled to kill a single young girl just 6 years ago, the current Lionel didn't even feel his heart fluctuate. His singular warning was all he cared to give them. Since they didn't listen once, he would send a very clear message. His grandfather had other worries that didn't allow him to act, but he, Lionel Morales, didn't have such scruples. He was already kicked out of the frontier of humanity. He was already a Tier 2 fugitive of the human domain. He was already out of patience. Boom. 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 The flames reflected in Lionel's irises as he watched with a hint of coldness within his gaze. He didn't know how the Brazinger family would react to this, but he hoped it would be foolish. That would give him more than enough reason to slaughter more of them. The debt of his mother-in-law had to be paid somehow. Chapter 1747. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:05 and 6 seconds a.m. Chapter 1747. Cost if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel urged his surfboard forward and entered the flagship before shooting off into the distance. He didn't have time to wait for what might come of the aftermath. He would deal with that when he returned. But for now, he had to set up his teleportation network. It wasn't long before Lionel arrived at the first location. It was a barren moon that orbited a planet that was just as barren. He entered the cave he had decided on, chiseling out a few concealment force arts that could bewilder the mind before following down a network of tunnels and finding a spacious enough location. He couldn't pick a spot that was too secluded or cramped because the teleportation network would work best if it could teleport at least a few dozen people at a time. Obviously, this needed not just a robust capacity on the part of the teleportation formation itself, but also on the space the teleportation platform was within. The surroundings had to be large and sturdy enough to withstand the fluctuations of force and, obviously, the appearance of so many people. Once Lionel found a suitable location, he took out a disc. After finding a method of escaping zones, Lionel felt that the mode of deployment he had used back then could be applied to other things. Back then, he had used a formation plate of sorts etched with runes. Originally, the reason he did that was twofold. First, it allowed him to create a solid foundation for the teleportation, something that was very much needed if he was going to connect the zone and the human domain together. And, secondly, it allowed it to be portable. This was very helpful because this meant that Lionel didn't need to waste time finding the perfect area which contained the fluctuations and densities of force he needed. He could just make the area his own. This concept worked exceptionally well with teleportation arrays like this one, as it would allow Lionel to deploy a large network of them exceptionally quickly. This disk that Lionel had created was just one of several thousand that he and the segmented cube had formed. All he needed to do was set it down, anchor it, and then activate it. It would take more time to travel between locations than it would take to create and set up these array plates. The best part was that he could always expand the network in the future. Lionel quickly left and continued to the next destination, and then the next. With the flagship, his speed of movement around the human domain could be considered to be as fast as it got. If not for the sheer number of stops, Lionel could have finished this matter even quicker, but he was insistent on having a teleportation array network that would allow him to reach any location within a few minutes at the worst. 3 days later, Lionel finally made it to the final location and tossed up the disc before exhaling a breath and releasing a large breath of spatial force. He raised up pillars of emulation spatial force before he nodded and slowly walked out. Stepping onto his surfboard, he shot into the air and returned to his flagship. All that was left to do now was to assemble his team, and there was only one group of men that he absolutely had to have by his side. Lionel grinned. He wondered how his brothers were doing. Quite frankly, he was worried for some of them. Arnold had probably ended up sucked into the zone along with the rest, and could only hope that he had survived. As for the others, they had been lucky enough to dodge that event. If Arnold had survived, then he was probably still in the Void Palace, and there wasn't much Lionel could do about that. The Void Palace was too large for Lionel to find a single person, so all he could do was make as much noise as he could. And even then, there was the possibility that Arnold had gone out on a mission, something that was very much possible. The rest of his brothers, though, should be on Earth or at least within Earth's territory. He would return to Earth first and see if he could find their traces. Lionel could only shake his head. He really did need an information network. But unfortunately, he didn't have one. Lionel looked off toward a certain direction with narrowed eyes. He currently stood at the bow of the flagship while his clones steered it toward his destinations. His main goal in doing this was to witness as much of the happenings of Earth's territory personally as he could so as to broaden his own horizons. Lionel wasn't particularly close to Earth currently. In fact, he was quite far. The final destination for his teleportation network had been near the edges of Earth's territory, so it was only right. With a thought, Lionel's gaze zoomed into the distance, skipping over thousands of kilometers at a time before he landed on what he was looking for. That woman. She in the distance, on an asteroid that seemed to have a floating convenience station on its back. A woman dressed in a tight-fitting black suit prowled forward like a cat. If Lionel had been there when Era had framed him and turned him into a fugitive of Shield Cross stars, he would have recognized this floating convenience asteroid as a location one came to for more than just refueling one's spaceships and stocking up on food and snacks. However, Lionel wasn't paying attention to that right now. He was rather paying attention to the woman who was about to kill the convenience station attendee. In his life, Lionel had only personally invited 2 people to become one of his generals, both of whom happened to be women. Even now he sometimes thought about them. Of course, not romantically, but rather in a faint understanding of how unfortunate it was that he didn't manage to bring them to his side. One of them was Kira, but she could only reject him because she apparently had a connection with one of his other cousins. The second one was this woman right here, a woman he had met during his final days in Valiant Heart Mountain, Emna. The current Emna was still within the 5th dimension, but Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow watching her moving. He actually felt a hint of danger coming from her. What Lionel didn't know was that a casual remark that he had made over 25 years ago now had led to the creation of one of the most fearsome intelligence networks of the human domain. And this casual remark hadn't been the one he made to Emna. As Lionel was about to receive a pleasant surprise, there was something far less amicable brewing on the opposite side of Earth's territory. News of the Prince of the Ascension Empire slaughtering an entire patrol unit of Brazingers spread like wildfire. In their fury, the Brazingers descended upon Earth. What Lionel didn't know was that this wouldn't be the first time. And what the Brazingers wouldn't want him to know was that the first descent had cost Lionel the lives of his brothers. Chapter 1748. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1748. No wonder if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel watched Emna move. At times she would seem like a prowling cat beast, and at other times she would become a sliding shadow. All of her movements were absolutely seamless and flowed from one to the next without the slightest wasted energy. There was only a single person that Lionel had ever seen move like this. And that was the love of his life, Aina. Aina always fought without the slightest bit of wasted energy. This was different from the more restrained style that Lionel had, albeit subtly. Lionel didn't seem to waste any energy on the surface only because he always chose the most efficient route to defeat all of his opponents, but efficiency and no wasted energy didn't necessarily mean the same thing. While the latter always encompassed the former, the vice versa wasn't necessarily true. Aina's battle style was the exact opposite of Lionel's, always suppressing her enemy with absolute strength and rarely ever holding anything back. However, even so, she never wasted a single strand of energy all the while. This was to say that Aina's method of using her body always managed to put 100% into her strike, her stride, and or her defense, much the same way. Emna managed to achieve this as well. That sort of instinctual battle style that always made perfect use of one's bodily strength. Just the fact that Lionel only knew one person like this, and that this person also happened to be the only individual Lionel had met that he felt truly matched him in talent. It was shocking enough to say the least. From Lionel's understanding, Aina's instinct in fighting came from her Brazinger family lineage factor, the Berserk God lineage factor. There was also a chance that it had undergone a slight mutation considering the fact that she was only half Brazinger as opposed to fully Brazinger, a fact of which was at the root of many of the issues she had faced in her life. However, Emna, or rather Emna Basiran, didn't have such a lineage factor as far as Lionel understood. In addition, he knew what her ability index was as well. She had the Blade Affinity ability index. And when he last met her, she was at the body as a blade stage, which allowed her to use blade forces from any location on her body. It was potentially possible that there wasn't just a single bastard child of the Brazinger family. If Aina's father could step out of the family, there was no saying that others couldn't do it as well. Plus, the fact that she didn't share the Brazinger family name was useless. Aina had always said that she would keep the Brazinger family name until the day they most wanted her to have it. Only then would she reject it. This obviously implied that Aina could change her name whenever she pleased. She just didn't want to. Lionel understood her feelings well. Aina was rejected from the family as a child. Her father was ostracized. She was burdened with a curse and her mother was executed. She wanted more than to just slaughter. She wanted them to lower their heads in shame. She wanted them to acknowledge that her mother wasn't as useless as they said she was. She wanted them to feel endless regret in their final moments. This was all to say that just because Emna didn't share the family name, didn't mean that she wasn't a Brazinger, as Lionel was lost in thought. Emna made it to the fat old man and attacked with a flash. Although Lionel could easily save the big-bellied man, or even just alert him to what was happening, he didn't do so. After separating his soul from his body, and especially after infusing the runes of the Emperor's Might lineage factor's core abilities, Lionel's sensitivity toward things had become a lot sharper. Not only could he apply pressure that found its roots in his demeanor and temperament, he could use it to somewhat see through the demeanors and temperaments of others. Lionel hadn't been able to do this in the past. At the very least he couldn't do it with such absolute assurance, but ever since the Emperor's Might tablet brought him along to perfectly grasp its secrets and integrate with his runes as though he had comprehended them all personally. This passive ability of his became far more active while also becoming more enigmatic. This was to say that Lionel could feel that Emna wasn't acting out of maliciousness. She had come here for a purpose and she even felt a faint hostility toward the man. At the same time, the big-bellied man had a shroud of shrewdness and subterfuge around him. These weren't things a person manning a normal gas station should have. It was clear that his identity wasn't as simple as it seemed. While others observing this might feel as though Emna was trying to rob the place. Although the station looked shabby, given its location, there was probably a large deposit of funds on it since it wasn't convenient to move them away given how out of the way this place was. However, Lionel saw an assassin about to execute an assignment they felt was important for reasons beyond the monetary compensation they would receive. Suddenly, Emna pounced, her finger piercing forward and shuttling through the throat of the big-bellied man. As expected, her blade affinity was far more potent than the past. In fact, Lionel's gaze flashed. It was no wonder he felt that she was so dangerous. The big-bellied man grabbed at his throat, roaring in fury. Seventh dimension. Lionel's brows shot up. He had been so focused on Emna that he hadn't properly seen through this big-bellied man. No, it was more like this man seemed to have a method of concealment. Emna immediately retreated as the aura of the big-bellied man descended. Without hesitation, Lionel urged the flagship forward, appearing within the asteroid belt in an instant. Chapter 1749. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1749. Big-bellied man. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The vitality of a seventh-dimensional existence was exceptional. Even when the seventh-dimensional existence in question had only taken the conventional path to get to their current level of strength, and sometimes especially so. Those that took the conventional path had to temper their bodies twice over, and as such the powerful ones among them would sometimes have this advantage even over those who took the God path. After all, it had to be remembered that not all those who took the conventional path were considered to be weak, although Emna's strike could be considered enough to kill almost anyone so long as they weren't like Lionel, and had their bodies and souls as two separate existences. The problem was how long it would take. A cornered beast was the most dangerous kind of animal, and a seventh-dimensional existence that knew they were going to die was even worse than a cornered beast. Lionel moved fast, but it would still take him 3 seconds to get there, most of the time of which was spent descending from the flagship. Emna realized the problem and retreated immediately, lamenting slightly. But this was already the best that she could do. If she could have aimed for the head instead, she would have done so. But the issue was that the bones of a seventh-dimensional existence were too incredible. Although it looked like she pierced casually through her target's throat, she had actually slipped her blade force through the vulnerable disc of the big-bellied man's spinal cord, making the resistance minimal. And yet, even so, it took her concentrating a great deal of power in her fingertip just to ensure she pierced flesh. It could be said that she was a madwoman. A fifth-dimensional existence assassinating a seventh-dimensional existence may have never happened before in the history of the dimensional verse. And yet here she was about to succeed. But it also seemed that this success would also cost her life, Despite how fast Emna retreated, she could never be faster than a seventh-dimensional existence. The big-bellied man released an infuriated roar, billowing into the skies as though lamenting the fact his life would end like this. Just the wind pressure and sound of the roar alone was enough to burst Emna's eardrums and make her feel as though her brain might turn to slush any moment. Her balance was thrown off and blade force didn't seem to want to respond to her anymore. Her equilibrium was completely out of wake, and the perfect efficiency of her movements were thrown out of the window. The big-bellied man smashed a palm downward. To Emna, it looked no different from a descending mountain. Just the momentum alone made her knees buckle. Move! The word suddenly echoed in Emna's mind. It was soft and soothing, and somehow also somewhat familiar, but at the same time, they carried an odd sort of power that gave her clarity of mind. She regained control of her body just enough for her to leap out of the way, but even so, the power of the big-bellied man's swipe was too strong. Just the residual impact alone was enough to send her flying into the distance, coughing up several mouthfuls of blood as she felt her entire body nearly collapse. Her bones shattered, her inner organs were skewered through, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head, a shuddering seizure rippling through her body. She rebounded against the asteroid's face hundreds of meters away. The big-bellied man snapped his neck toward the direction she flew in, seemingly not feeling the pain of his neck being pierced through at all. He was riding an emotional high as the final seconds of his life ticked by. He bent his knees, leaping over with a fierce momentum. He crossed half the distance in just a single bound as though the convenience station didn't have even artificial gravity. However, if he had been conscious of what just happened, despair would grip his heart. If it wasn't for his vitality rapidly draining away, how could he only just so far? If he was in peak condition, even jumping double the distance to Emna in a single bound would have been easy. Still, in his current state, the big-bellied man didn't care. Gathering up his strength and bounding forward again, he appeared in the skies above Emna, casting a shadow over her. Emna's vision was blurry and she could barely see what was happening. She could vaguely feel that a shadow had appeared above her, but she could only hope that it was the shadow of the person that had just saved her. If it wasn't, she would truly be finished. Unfortunately for Emna, she wasn't so lucky. 3 seconds was just too small a time frame to a seventh-dimensional expert. If they really wanted to, even attacking dozens of times within that span was as easy as breathing. Luckily, Lionel didn't need to catch up entirely. He just had to enter rage to effect change. Lionel, who was speeding over with his jet-black surfboard, suddenly raised a hand. Bouncing in the skies like that and falling through the air put the big-bellied man in a compromised position. Activating his emulation spatial force, Lionel thrust at the back of the falling big-bellied man, throwing him off course from his descent onto Emna. Bang! Lionel activated his starry light domain and flickered forward 3 times, finally catching up and appearing above the big-bellied man. A spear appeared in Lionel's palm, and he struck outward with an undeniable momentum. The big-bellied man growled and looked upward to meet the strike, but Lionel's gaze flashed. Emperor's gaze. To Lionel's astonishment, however, the big-bellied man reacted as though nothing had happened as he continued to punch upward. Lionel's pupils constricted. This man had a soul protection treasure, and a very good one at that. Bang! Chapter 1750. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1750. I need information if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's arm went numb for a moment, and he was pushed back into the skies somewhat. However, at the same time, the big-bellied man nearly fell to his knees, his body growing far too weak to handle the impact. Lionel's gaze flashed, and he activated his bronze aura immediately. He hadn't done so before because he was reliant on his Emperor's gaze to finish this in one move, but he made a mental note that he would have to be more careful in the future before he urged his surfboard forward again, and struck out once more with a fiercer momentum. Bang! This time, the big-bellied man's retort was even weaker than before, and he was forced to his knees, his body shuddering as crimson blood so thick it almost looked black fell from the hole in his neck. A ripple of force dissipated along Lionel's bronze aura as he descended once more, swiftly cutting the big-bellied man's head from his neck. Lionel caught the head in his free palm, his gaze somewhat serious. To think that the difficulty in dealing with a man on his last legs would be so great. Of course, it was probably also true that this man was quite powerful amongst conventional path seventh-dimensional existences. But even so, he was still losing a large amount of his strength for every breath he took. And yet he still managed to repel Lionel. These soul protection treasures are so well hidden and their auras are so restrained. I'll need to find and analyze the one this man used, so I can not only create some in the future, but so that I can also know ahead of time whether a target of mine has such protection or not. If I make that mistake in the future, it'll be more than a little troublesome. It wasn't that Lionel was helpless against soul protection treasures, but if he wanted to bypass them it would also take more preparation. There were tiers within the abilities of Emperor's Might. Especially for an ability as fundamental as Emperor's Gaze. It was just that the lowest level was the quickest to deploy in a pinch. Lionel hesitated for a moment before tossing the corpse and the head into a snow globe and rushing toward Emna, who was most definitely on her last legs. Emna couldn't see straight, and she had no idea that she had been saved. The gap between the fifth and seventh dimension was simply far too vast, but she was lucky that she had Lionel by her side. Lionel pressed his hands together and a large amount of vital star force and life force began to emit from him. Even if he didn't do anything else, just being in the proximity of these sixth-dimensional forces would be able to bring Emna back from the brink of death. But even so, Lionel still began to draw a force art. This force art was based on the style of Camelot's magic system, and it was quite crude since Lionel was formulating it on the spot. But to save a fifth-dimensional existence, it was more than good enough. As Lionel's spell descended, Emna, who was barely conscious, could feel her bones mending and her organs healing at a visible pace. In just a few seconds, her vision had cleared enough to see Lionel standing over, and in just a few more seconds, she felt better than she ever had in her entire life. It was almost like she had been reborn. Instinctually, Emna scurried to her feet, realizing that she wasn't dressed very appropriately as the strike had destroyed a lot of her clothing. She crossed an arm over her chest and looked toward Lionel. Although she was wary, she still wanted to say her thanks as it was obvious this person had saved her. But just as she was going to, she froze. "It's you." Lionel smiled lightly. "It seems that you remember me. That's good. How could I not? You're the reason." Emna trailed off, seemingly realizing that she was about to say something embarrassing. Lionel raised an eyebrow. "I'm the reason?" Emna fidgeted before gritting her teeth and speaking. "You're the reason we've all been working so hard." Lionel blinked, feeling quite speechless. He had a small amount of charm, but it definitely wasn't to the point that a woman he had only spoken to once would dedicate the next 20 years of her life to him, just off the back of a single conversation. Right? And also, who was this we? Seeing that Lionel was confused, Emna felt her heart sink slightly. Although she knew that it was a small chance, she had hoped that Lionel would remember them. There was a bit of strife in their organization, and many of the malcontent came from the fact that many didn't believe they should be working so hard for a man they hadn't seen in decades. Some even said he wouldn't even appreciate their efforts, and that they should just be working for themselves. Of course, although these hit a sore spot, Emna knew the words were bullshit. Those people just wanted to move the organization toward a more selfish place, forgetting the reason they were established in the first place. However, seeing Lionel's reaction now, it was hard for her to not feel a small hint of resentment, and even feel that maybe those people had some merit to their words. Suddenly Lionel's gaze flashed. "Who is your leader?" Lionel suddenly asked. Emna sighed. Although she was disappointed, Lionel had still saved her life. "Is it Raylion and Hephaestus?" Hearing this, Emna's head snapped up to meet Lionel's gaze, a hint of expectation within them. Seeing her face was all Lionel needed. It seemed that he had been correct. Back then, after Valiant Heart Mountain was attacked by the other organizations of their quadrant, they had been forced to disband. In fact, the only reason their disciples survived and were able to escape was because Lionel came back and held the line for them as they did so. As such, the former top disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain, Raylion, wanted to do something to pay Lionel back. But in his pride, he wasn't willing to join Lionel without anything to give. He wasn't more powerful than Lionel, so he couldn't protect the latter. He wasn't richer than Lionel, nor did he have a stronger background than Lionel, so he couldn't support the latter. But he had still been determined to do something. Before they left, Lionel remembered saying some casual words that he hadn't thought about even once since then. "I need information." Lionel mumbled the same words that he had said back then. "And I need a lot of it." Raylion hadn't stopped after hearing his words back then, but Lionel could still sense the blazing fire of his will. Lionel suddenly smiled. He couldn't be blamed for not seeing through this immediately. From the beginning, Emna wasn't even a member of Valiant Heart Mountain. She was from a rival organization. How could he draw the connection so easily? Emna's eyes glistened like stars. Those words, they were the motto of their organization. How interesting. In that case, what was your mission here? Why did you kill this man? Lionel asked a question that had him feeling curious. Even he couldn't quite deduce what was happening here. Chapter 1751. Published at 10th of April, 2023. 11:04 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 1751. Unprecedented. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Right. Emna looked around but couldn't find the body. After a while she shook her head. It didn't matter much. The root of the mission wasn't the body at all, rather it was twofold. One aspect was for the sake of an offensive maneuver with defensive underpinnings. The second aspect was for the information that was likely here. This place is a station of Shield Cross stars. This was a simple sentence. But the instant Lionel heard them, his expression turned serious. This wasn't just because of the words themselves, but it was rather because Emna was so forthright with this information to begin with. He could imagine the amount of effort it would have taken to get this sort of information. And while it seemed that Emna had a good impression of him, likely stemming from their first meeting and her interactions with Raylion and Hephaestus, the fact she could give him such an important piece of information without blinking just went to show how high his place in her heart was. It was an odd feeling. Lionel had gotten very used to running into enemies wherever he went. There was even a point in time where he felt that maybe he had overestimated his charisma in the past. Why else could he not seem to make any friends in the dimensional verse? However, Lionel made a mistake a lot of successful people, or just people in general, really. He focused a lot on the bad and didn't spend a lot of time looking toward his back view. While there was a trail of devastation in his wake, there was also a lot of good that he had done. He hadn't seen the light of hope in the eyes of Earth's ministers just a few days ago when he returned. He hadn't seen the joy in the eyes of the citizens of the Ascension Empire when they had heard of his return. He hadn't experienced the relief they felt when he massacred the Brazinger family members in the skies. And these were just the people of Earth. There were still the remaining members of Valiant Heart Mountain whose lives he had saved, and there was still Emna who had seen him single-handedly take on the Milky Way Guild that day. There were still the Cataclysm Generation geniuses of the Void Palace who appreciated his helping them escape the Rapak's nest. There was still Simona who cried when he returned to her beast partner. And there would still come a day where the disciples of the Void Palace learned that it was under his actions that their lives had been saved. There would always be people who didn't appreciate his efforts, but not every person could ignore their conscience so easily. There was bad in the world, but there was often good to be found as well. Even if the latter was on a smaller scale. Emna had no idea that her simple words had made Lionel smile from the depths of his heart for the first time in a long while. Emna was so caught off guard by the genuine smile that she froze, forgetting the next words that she was going to speak. It took her a long time to recover, and by the time she realized that she had made such a mistake, she could only blush down to her chest. If the others of their organization could see Emna now, they would probably be stunned speechless. This cold beauty actually knew how to blush? Emna didn't really know what was happening at the moment either. It was just that she felt this sort of overwhelming magnetism coming from Lionel, one that even she could resist. For a moment, she even thought that it would be worthwhile to die for this man. What was the most shocking, though, was that unlike other charm techniques, not only was Emna hyper-aware of this feeling, she didn't even feel any rejection toward it. Despite being aware that there had to be something odd going on, she still didn't feel fear or disgust. It was an incredibly odd feeling. This was what the four great families feared the most. It wasn't Emperor's aura, nor was it Emperor's gaze, nor was it any of the Emperor's commandments. It was Emperor's charm. Emperor's charm wasn't a technique of Emperor's might. Rather, it was a passive skill that took root as the soul of the wielder of Emperor's might was continuously cleansed and refined beneath the Emperor runes. The more clear and refined the soul became, the more influence the emotions of the Emperor would have on the world around them. When the Emperor smiled, the stars would sing. When the Emperor was furious, the skies would sunder. Just now, Lionel felt genuinely happy, a happiness that originated from the depths of his soul. Because of his genuineness, the clarity of his soul influenced Emna. If Emperor's charm was in the hands of a scheming individual who hid their thoughts or never allowed themselves to feel genuine emotion, it wasn't too big of a deal. However, if it was in the hands of someone with true charisma, someone who truly cared for the lives of those around him to the point that he would find happiness in just a simple action, that would be the true Emperor's might. That was what the four great families feared the most. Most of the time, Lionel's true thoughts hid behind a veil of logic and reasoning. But when they shone through, they shone fiercer than most. When he was enraged, nothing else mattered. When he was happy, he would smile, grin, and joke. And often, because he only rarely allowed himself to feel such things, when they did occur, they were far more potent than the emotions of others. It could be said without a doubt that in the hands of Lionel, Emperor's charm would unleash an astonishing might. And after he had already assimilated one of the three supreme skills of Emperor's might, the clarity of Lionel's soul was unprecedented. Chapter 1752. Published at 10th of April, 2023. 11:04 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1752. So, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel seemed to realize what happened and retracted his aura, allowing Emna to finally breathe a sigh of relief. If that feeling was persistent, she had no idea how she would even speak with Lionel for an extended period of time. Her heart might beat out of her chest before she could finish a single sentence. Right. Emna shook her head, not daring to look into Lionel's eyes. This station is under the jurisdiction of Shield Cross Stars. As an organization, they're capable of gathering up a large amount of information, and it's difficult to pin them down on anything. Even after they retreated from Earth's territory, their hooks are still deeply embedded. The goal of this mission was to catch them off guard, and maybe see if we can find any clues about finding other stations like this one. After our merger with the former Milky Way Guild, we gained a lot of the information they had on hand and benefited from it. Amongst that information were some of the stations they had been able to unearth over several centuries. But even so, there were only 3. Lionel's gaze flickered. For a long while, the Milky Way Guild had had a monopoly on Earth's home galaxy, but due to this, it was also a convenient target for outside influences. Due to this, Era's father found himself constantly dealing with power struggles. However, it was also due to this that the former guild head had gained a great amount of opportunities as well. The last time Lionel had seen guild head Ovaltine, the latter had just broken into the 6th dimension and turned the tables on the Radix, Midas, Rain, Flora and Umbra families. But it seemed that his schemes ran deeper than even this, considering he knew of a station that existed so far away from the Milky Way galaxy. I see, but isn't Shield Cross Stars the police force of the human domain? Why do you want to target their influence? If the higher-ups of Shield Cross Stars knew that Lionel had actually spoken such words, they might truly cough up blood and fury. Since when did Lionel have respect for Shield Cross Stars and its work? He actually had the cheek to say such a thing while one of their stolen ships loomed over his head. Emna seemed to know that Lionel just wanted to hear her answer. After all, they had already gotten news that Shield Cross Stars was being kicked out of Earth's territory. So how could they be unaware of the events leading up to it? It could only be said that this organization, a few words of Lionel's had helped to form, wasn't nothing short of impressive. They've been abusing their power for a long time. But it's never been a systemic issue. It was mostly just a few corrupt officers here and there, taking advantage of their station. However, in just the last few days, things have gone from a few bad apples to becoming something far more sinister. Lionel's gaze narrowed. According to our intel, of 10 incidents creeping up in our territory, at least 8 of them are as a direct result of SCS's interference, although none of it is obvious. Their fingerprints are all over the place, and we were able to find out using these 3 unearthed stations as observation points. After we realized what was happening, there was some discussion about which steps to take next, but we were undecided on what to do. With only 3 observation points, there were too many other potential variables, and even our 8 out of 10 assessment was just an extrapolation without solid evidence. So, Emna felt a bit embarrassed when she got to this point in the story. The reality was that she didn't have authorization to come here. Although the idea of her coming had been floated, most had decided that it was far too dangerous. The most powerful individual of their organization was still Guild Head Ovaltine, but even after 20 years, he was still in the 6th dimension, and there was simply no way for him to against a 7th dimensional existence head-on. Emna, with her abilities, probably had the best chance, but once again it was far too dangerous. In fact, if not for Lionel's sudden appearance, she would have already lost her life. Just the residual shockwave from a weakened 7th dimensional expert's infuriated strike had left her in a half-dead state, and not far from the jaws of death. It was even more accurate to say that she really had died, as she had suffered fatal damage. Just a few more seconds, and she wouldn't have been able to hold on any longer. This was all to say that Emna had actually acted on her own, not liking the stalemate they had reached. The internal strife and voices of dissension were getting louder every day, and the original members needed a way to solidify their prestige once again. And the best method to do so would be to prove that Emna could assassinate even a 7th dimensional existence. If she had succeeded, how many would still dare to talk so much? Even without Emna saying it out loud, just by her demeanor, Lionel could guess most of it. Either way, now that we've succeeded, this is a good opportunity. We can scan the base and see if we can find any information that might help with finding out more news. Lionel nodded. He was on a time crunch right now, as there were at least 3 separate incidents that needed to be shut down as soon as possible, but this matter was very important as well. Without Shield Cross Star's backing, there would be much fewer flare-ups. Let's take a look then. Lionel and Emna made their way and began to search the convenience station. However, even after several minutes and the use of his Starry Spirit domain, Lionel couldn't seem to find anything. Chapter 1753. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1753. Impressed. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Emna didn't know that there was nothing to find yet. To her, it had only been a few minutes, and she had no idea that Lionel was capable of enveloping the entire asteroid, even to the point of penetrating to its core. In fact, the fact Lionel had spent a few minutes on this task at all just went to show how thorough he had been. In reality, he already knew that there was nothing to find after a single instant. There has to be something here. Lionel thought that it might be hidden on the corpse itself, but he had already scanned the corpse at all, and there was nothing to be found. Not even the slightest mark of Shield Cross Stars was present. There was simply nothing. Lionel felt that he had to think outside of the box. The instant he shifted his perspective, something suddenly clicked. With large strides, Lionel crossed the convenience station and entered its outhouse. It was just a small box barely 2 meters tall. Just to step into it, Lionel had to duck, and the smell was absolutely horrid. There was nothing in this place aside from a hole in the ground and a single phone. Lionel snapped his fingers, and with a whoosh, a blinding golden light cleansed everything, and he picked up the phone that looked as though it had come right out of Earth's 19th century. After a moment, Lionel's expression flickered, and he placed the phone back down. There were 3 mechanisms on the phone, each one more layered than the last, and they were all exceptionally well hidden. The first allowed it to function as a normal communication device. The second was a diversion tactic that scattered the signal and made it difficult to trace. The third was the real communication network, connecting this phone to a very specific subset of other phones. Lionel's hand formed a clawing motion and ripped the phone from the walls of the outhouse. He had to carefully analyze this himself, or he could hand it over the segmented cube to do. Regardless of the choice, it required the utmost amount of secrecy. Stepping out of the outhouse, Lionel looked into the distance to find that Emna was still looking. He observed her for a moment, shaking his head. She was truly an anomaly. She reminded Lionel a lot of a term that he hadn't heard in a very long time. A spark. A spark was a genius who would become the starting flare to a powerful lineage. The accomplishments of their future influenced their abilities in the present, creating a feedback loop that made them even more powerful than should be possible. What was common within sparks, though, was that they didn't have the backing of powerful families or organizations. In the beginning of his journey, Lionel had been mistaken for a spark many times before, but for obvious reasons. Ever since he entered the Void Palace and became a second-generation wastrel, no one had accused him of such a thing again. Emna, though, was different. Lionel had already realized why she felt so threatening. Her blade affinity ability index allowed her to use her body as a blade, and she had pushed this to the very pinnacle of the 4th tier. But beyond that, she had gone from being able to turn her body into a blade to being able to turn her blades into her body. This seemed like a simple reversal, but the truth was that this was a huge change. In fact, it was enough to call this a mutation of the ability index. In fact, Lionel felt that Emna had already taken the step toward turning her ability index into an incredibly powerful lineage factor. The current Emna had control over 6th-dimensional blade force, not 5th. Setting aside just how rare it was to comprehend a weapon force beyond your dimension, if Lionel was correct, she was using this blade force to reconstruct her body. If the Morales family had a body of metal, Emna was creating a lineage factor that forged her body of blade force. Due to this, she was able to break free of the usual restrictions of her dimensional tier, meaning that she had already stepped onto her own path. In fact, it was even more exaggerated than just this. Lionel had a feeling that the reason Emna hadn't stepped into the 6th dimension wasn't because she couldn't, but rather because she was subconsciously aware that if she did so, she would lose this opportunity forever. If Emna managed to perfect her self-created lineage factor before entering the 6th dimension, she would create a path separate from the god and conventional paths. And because this path was created by her own hands, her strength would be almost unprecedented. If Emna's path were to be boiled down into a few words, she wouldn't have to worry about anything outside of improving her blade. As her blade improved, so would she. Once she perfected this lineage factor, her dimensional level would be decided by her blade force level. It was no wonder Emna had such perfect and efficient control over her body. In her eyes, she wasn't controlling her body at all, but rather her blades. From Lionel's senses, he could see that Emna was already a step away from forming 7th-dimensional blade force. This meant that it was very likely that on the day she succeeded, she would leap from the 5th dimension into the 7th dimension directly. And not only that, but she would also be among one of the most powerful 7th-dimensional powerhouses in the whole of the human domain. This is the power of fusing your paths into one. Her ability index, her partially completed lineage factor, even her practice method itself, all have the exact same origin, and due to that, she's extraordinarily powerful, even to the point of being able to assassinate a 7th-dimensional powerhouse at the 5th dimension. Lionel was rarely impressed. Too rarely. But at this moment, he was completely won over. It seemed that his judgment was quite good. Chapter 1754. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1754. Silence. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. I've got it. Lionel suddenly spoke. There was no point in watching Emna run around like a headless chicken. He didn't believe that she would find much of anything else even if she dug to the center of the asteroid. Emna looked up with surprise. It had only been a few seconds, Why did Lionel make it sound so final? Also, why was he holding that contraption? This is a communication device. I haven't analyzed it yet, but it should be embedded into a network of other similar communication devices. So long as we analyze it properly, it won't be very difficult to find the locations of the other stations. I believe that this is all there is to find. Emna's brows raised. She could somewhat tell that although Lionel was being a bit reserved with his words, he was absolutely certain about his assessment. You want to do the analysis personally? Emna asked. Lionel nodded. Deconstructing this will take someone at least nearing the extremities of the silver grade, and it would be even better if they had a working knowledge of the gold grade. The force arts used are highly complex, and a single mistake could cause the entire network to collapse. I feel the most comfortable if I do it. Okay. Emna agreed readily, but she was inwardly surprised. Lionel seemed to be implying that he was at such a standard, which was shocking for someone so young. Just making it into the sixth dimension shouldn't guarantee being a silver grade crafter. Regardless, their organization truly didn't have anyone near that standard. They only had a few silver grade crafters, but they were nowhere near the extremities of the grade. In that case, will you return now? I can't. Lionel shook his head. There are about 3 big issues I have to deal with as quickly as possible before they spin out of control. I need to return to Earth to gather up my brothers first and deal with them as quickly as possible. I will come and touch base with you in. Lionel's voice trailed off. His senses were far too sharp. The instant he mentioned his brothers, Emna's gaze flickered with an unreadable light, almost as though she had thought of something, but couldn't quite confirm it. However, after a few moments, her expression suddenly became a hint solemn, a hint regretful, and then a hint hesitant. Seeing that Lionel suddenly fall silent, Emna's heart skipped a beat. There was nothing but silence, and in the depths of space. This shouldn't be too shocking, but for some reason everything seemed to have come to a stop. Lionel didn't ask any questions, but his expressionless gaze seemed to put all the onus on her. Emna didn't know where to start. For some reason, she felt herself shivering. This was already the second time she had lost her composure in front of Lionel. She, an assassin known for her nerves of steel, couldn't even quite make herself look this man in the eye. His presence seemed sturdier than the earth and broader than the skies. It was absolutely suffocating. Emna exhaled a shaky breath. During Earth's metamorphosis into the sixth dimension, 4 families suddenly appeared outside of the usual noble families. They felt far stronger than the most powerful 3 of Earth. The Fox family, the Dove family, and the Scarlet family. They were the Aderna family, the Critus family, the Lavis family, and the Brazinger family. Earth fell into a situation of great internal strife, which made it difficult to stop outside influences from also encroaching onto their territory, and war broke out on Earth's surface for the second time since Terrain's assault. I don't know. The situation was too odd. It didn't feel like those 4 families were trying very hard. They didn't press where they had to, and they gave up a lot of opportunities seemingly without cause or reason. But regardless, the end result was devastating and many lost their lives. During that time, many of the young talents of Earth who had managed to make it into the Void Palace returned. Back then, the situation of the Void Palace hadn't been stabilized, as all of the Void Elders and Void Senators had yet to return. As such, the rules were far easier to break. When they returned, however, the nonchalance of the 4 families seemed to vanish, as though this was exactly what they had been looking for. In one fell swoop, they sent out their own geniuses, and the geniuses of Earth that had rocked and shocked the human domain were devastated. They died in droves. Almost an entire generation of Earth's greatest talents died one after another. It was only after Princess Alienor returned from the cataclysm that the tides managed to turn. But even so, it went from a slaughterfest to a stalemate, and once again, the 4 families went back to their oddly passive behavior until they suddenly sent out another wave. Beneath this wave, even the likes of Princess Alienor found herself terribly suppressed, until she finally managed to break into the 7th dimension. Only then did the situation truly stabilize, and the 4 families took a step back. Even in doing so, however, they carved out large amounts of Earth's territory for themselves, taking over several planets and even the moon itself. In that war, several of your brothers died. Drake, Milan, Gil, Franco and Raj. They didn't make it. Lionel didn't say anything from start to finish. Even when Emna was done, he stood in silence, simply closing his eyes. He didn't seem to breathe, as though he had become a standing corpse. His heart didn't beat. The world seemed to lose the ability to interact with him, as though he had stepped into a world completely separate from them. Without a word, Lionel turned and walked away. Emna opened her mouth to say something, but couldn't bring herself to say anything in the end. She had been there when Lionel went against the Milky Way Guild all alone just to not risk implicating his brothers. She knew well how deep their relationship ran. Even though Lionel hadn't said a single word, she knew he was furious. Endlessly furious. Chapter 1755. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1755. Fury. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Mighty auras surrounded Earth. The ocean tides rose like walls blocking out the skies. Forests worth of trees swayed so violently that they threatened to be pulled up by the roots, and the earth shook and quaked, splintering, dividing and rippling like waves. A shadow seemed to envelop the planet. The sheer number of ships and vessels in the skies made it feel as though an eclipse had descended, stripping Earth of all of its light. When these members of the Brazinger family appeared, the protective units of Earth reacted immediately. Several cannons pointed into the sky as the air protection units took action first. Not long later, a strong surge of pressure soared upward, countering the presence of the Brazinger family almost immediately. If Lionel had been here, he would have recognized these people as the members of the Slayer Legion. However, by now, they had already returned to their proper duty of being the shields of the royal family. At the helm, a middle-aged man with the aura of an old ruffian stood on the walls of a fort, a machete resting on his shoulder. This middle-aged man was none other than Old Hutch, the only pseudo-master figure Lionel had ever had in his life. By now, Old Hutch didn't seem so old anymore, and his aura was even sharper and more violent than it ever had been before. By his side, there was yet another old man that Lionel would have recognized, and that was his coach Owen, whose upper lip was still bristling with a gray mustache. The duo looked infuriated with the world, but right now, they had every right to be. The number of promising youths that Earth had lost at the hands of these four families was far too many. What these two older men had in common was their love of watching the youth rise up. And yet they had to watch helplessly as they outlived some young men and women they had viewed almost like their own sons and daughters. Old Hutch had lost count of the number of promising youths of the Slayer Legion that had fallen before him. He had promised himself that such a thing wouldn't happen again after the war against Terrain, and yet it all didn't matter in the slightest. He was used to having the strength to turn the tides on his own, but he was born long before the metamorphosis. The amount of talent he had was limited in comparison to the up-and-coming youths because he had to work against the tides of age for every step forward he took. Time and time again, the moniker of Hacker Hutch became no different from an ironic jab to the heart for him. What Hacker Hutch? Unless it meant that he stood idly by as his children were hacked to pieces, then maybe only then could he so proudly accept the name. Coach Owen's mustache whipped about in the wind, his gaze red with fury. Ever since Lionel had sent him back to Earth and saved him from the brink of death, he had been doing his best to raise up the contingent. He hadn't forgotten the tough ask Lionel had made of him. He believed in that young man to the point he had put his heart and soul into the task, and yet he could only watch as his boys died one after another. He had been coaching Lionel and the others since they could barely hold a football in their hands. He had watched them grow into men who could carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, only for them to be slaughtered one after another. Even now, he could still remember the final grins on their faces as they breathed their last. He could see the young Drake. Even after a decade, they still called that poor brat a rookie even though he was maybe more mature than them all. All his life, Drake had had big shoes to fill. As Lionel's backup and the man fated to succeed Lionel, that was a weight he had carried with him, and yet, instead of shirking from the responsibility, he accepted it in silence. His mark on the world seemed so small, and yet, it was that small mark, that silence that made him so strong. He could see Milan's face, that cheery young man who always swore to protect Lionel's front. He was the wall, the first line of defense, a young man who would dig in his heels rather than bend his back. Arnold was a man who never showed any sort of emotion, never deviating from his baseline, but seeing his ball like a little boy when Milan breathed his life was a sound and sight that Coach Owen would never forget. Every time he recalled it, another piece of his heart would shatter. Pialfa knew. He could see the face of Gil and Franco, that pair of perverts who always relentlessly butt heads. He remembered their final moments, standing side by side like brothers, neither of them wanting to retreat from the side of the other. Even amidst all their arguments, their bond was maybe among the very strongest in the end. He could see the face of Raj, that big lug who always had some witty to say. He was Lionel's blindside protector, a forever wall, an immovable force. Even in his final moments, he stood tall and sturdy, a silly but sad grin plastered on his face. He roared into the skies, lamenting only the fact that he didn't get the chance to build his harem before he breathed his last. Every time Coach Owen thought of these memories, he wanted to roar into the skies, his fury rising like a tempest. However, when he saw what was in the skies, Coach Owen was so apoplectic with rage that his vision went entirely black, the city walls beneath his feet shattering. Amidst the brazingers, a young man with a group of 8 lenses hovering over a single eye stepped forward. His face didn't seem to have any fury or rather on it. In fact, he seemed to be distracted by words and numbers flying across his lenses. He stood on a platform of pure black that seemed fused together with black-silver sand, absent-mindedly doing something before he seemed to realize where he was. If Lionel was present, he would recognize this young man as Simeon, the very first true member of the Brazinger family he had ever met. However, if Lionel had been present, he wouldn't have been looking at Simeon at all. Rather, he would have been looking at the 2 young men who hovered beneath him, seemingly holding up his platform. On one side, there was a large young man, standing at over 7 feet tall, and with a belly as round as a globe. His skin was a nice brown color, however his gaze seemed dull and lifeless. On the other side was an unassuming young man of slim stature and somewhat handsome features. He seemed reserved and he would be difficult to pick out in a crowd, but his gaze was likewise dull and lifeless. Anyone could see the large young man had been used to form that platform while the other young man was used to carry and control the platform. Together, they moved it smoothly and without issue, moving like a pair of obedient servants. These 2 young men were none other than Raj and Drake. Chapter 1756, published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1756. Ball of fire. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. After a long while, Simeon seemed to finally remember where he was and he snapped out of his thoughts, casually looking down toward the fort beneath him. Despite the fact firepower capable of blasting the moon to pieces was trained on him, his expression didn't flicker even a single time. Simeon's hands clapped close in the air as though he was closing an invisible book. Everything about his actions were casual and unhurried. "Where is your emperor? Why has he not come out to see me yet?" Simeon's words were soft but they spread with an insuppressible might. He didn't seem to take Emperor Fox seriously at all, directly asking him to make his presence known. Fury surged in the hearts of the citizens of Earth. Emperor Fox was a god in all of their hearts. The prestige he had built up from the 3rd-dimensional realms into the 7th-dimensional realms was incomparably solid, as much as the people also had Lionel in their hearts, erasing hundreds of years of near worship in just a handful of years was impossible. In addition, as far as everyone else saw it, Lionel's accomplishments, and Noah's for the matter, were only right. After all, how could Emperor Fox have inferior grandchildren? Every time they accomplished something mighty, it was actually only bolstering Emperor Fox in the eyes of the people. As a result, in return for his words, Simeon only received nothing but silence. However, this sort of silence was harmonious in its symphony. Billions of gazes looked into the skies, their expressions just the same. Simeon suddenly sneered. A collection of ants. Since your emperor refuses to give me an explanation for the slaughter of my people, then that makes this matter even simpler. A debt of blood must be repaid with blood. Wipe out half the population of Earth and imprison the other half. That should be about enough to weigh evenly. The words of Simeon couldn't have been more demeaning, not mentioning the sheer number of Earthlings who had died during the first descent of the four families. How could a few dozen or even 100 lives compare to the billions on Earth currently? In the decades Lionel had been gone, the main priority of the Ascension Empire was to increase the population of Earth, which had been whittled to strikingly few after the metamorphosis. To increase from a population of just millions to billions in just a few decades sounded ridiculous, and truly it was. However, under a shocking change, the people of Terrain who should have taken 5 generations to become true citizens of Earth only took a single one under some mysterious power. Of course, this mysterious power was bestowed by Emperor Fox himself, which was also a large part of the reason the citizens of Earth were so respectful of him. The people of Terrain thought that they would be forced to be enslaved for generations before they got a chance. Some of the more pessimistic among them thought that this was all a lie and they would never gain such a chance. But in a twist of fate, they could see with their own eyes as their children rose up to become paragons and young elites of the human race. Just like this, the vast majority of the former people of Terrain wholeheartedly embraced Earth as their home. From the very beginning, it was not their choice to wage war against Earth. It had always been the choice of a few families and organizations. The rewards gained would have never been their own to begin with. But now, their thoughts had long since strayed from Terrain. That barren place wasn't their home. This was their home. They too had fought in the war against the four families. They too had watched their youths die one after another. They too felt the stiling hatred as they stared up into the skies. So when Simeon's voice descended, their fury rose up like a tempest, seemingly wanting to shred Simeon to pieces with nothing more than their eyes. But, even so, with a casual glance, Simeon waved a hand toward the warriors to his back. Without fail, each of them exuded mighty and unprecedented auras. Their strengths caused even the air to quake. However, before they could take action, there was a sudden change atop the blooming ascension tree. A mighty golden light shot into the skies. Simeon's sneer returned. Now your emperor wants to appear? It's far too late for that. Maybe if the mighty Emperor Fox falls to his knees, I might consider reducing the punishment by 10%. The pillar of light shot into the skies, tearing through the clouds and appearing tall and proud. When the lights cleared, Simeon's sneer paused. At that moment, it became clear that it wasn't Emperor Fox at all, but rather a young man wielding a saber easily twice the length of his body. Despite not having a flying treasure, he stood in the skies as easily as though it was the earth. With just a single glance, every person of Earth recognized this young man. This was none other than their prince, Noah Fox. Noah stood in the air with a violent look in his eyes. He was a man that rarely showed any sort of emotion at all. But hearing the piercing words about the man he respected most, his grandfather, the murderous intent in Noah's heart had reached its absolute peak. Even so, when he saw the state of Raj and Drake's corpses, a fiendish green radiance burst from his body, causing the skies to dark and the clouds to accumulate. Simeon's frozen sneer became an expressionless gaze soon after, his raised hand continuing to descend and point forward. A mere prince of this backwater place? Who the hell cared if he was infuriated? The warriors of the Brazinger family charged forward. What no one expected was that the moment war was about to descend, the situation would change entirely. All sound vanished and the world seemed to lose its color. All those who looked into the skies could see a blinding ray of white light thousands of kilometers across. It was brighter than even the sun itself, burning its image into the minds of all those who saw it. The moment the beam appeared, it collided with the moon and a void seemed to form. The entire moon was swallowed whole in the blink of an eye. When the beam vanished, there was no lush greenery or gorgeous blue oceans any longer. There was only a land of black and ash, burnt to a crisp with a single strike. The moon, its resources, its people, had all been eradicated in a breath. The temperature of Earth began to slowly rise as though a second sun had appeared in the skies, the wild flames pulsing at the hearts of all those who laid eyes on it. When the people of the Brazinger family turned back, they couldn't help but freeze in absolute silence. In the skies, a shadow seemed to walk out from those flames, the darkness around him entirely conspicuous as a moon-sized ball of fire flickered to his back. Chapter 1757. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1757. Wreathed in blood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The figure was nothing more than a speck of dust in comparison to the size of the moon. And yet as he walked forward, it felt as though the moon had lit itself on fire to herald his appearance. The sound of billions of heartbeats beating in unison began to drum across the skies. The entire world seemed to resonate with the footsteps of this young man as he took one step after another. Despite his seemingly slow pace, he crossed countless kilometers with every stride. And by the time he had come close enough for his features to be differentiable from the blazing moon to his back, the shock that took hold of those watching him was enough to stop their hearts entirely. Lionel slowly walked through the skies, his gaze frighteningly cold and his lips pinched into a line. Wisps of red fog came from his eyes, his breath and his hair, the menacing stench of blood rising into the skies. He looked as though he had just crawled out from his own coffin. A ghastly wound stretched from his left chest down to his right hip, showing off glistening bronze pieces of his rib cage and inner organs. His left arm hung from his shoulder socket by just a few tendons and ligaments. His clothing was nowhere to be seen, and he walked completely in the nude. Seemingly oblivious to this fact entirely, it truly seemed as though that he just might collapse at any moment. So why were they feeling such fear? The ghastly black rod in Lionel's right hand billowed with fiendish fog as dark as night. It suddenly trembled, forcing the amorphous fog to sharp and become a twin pair of menacing curved blades that found their home at the end of the rod. Lionel didn't speak a single word. He didn't roar in rage. He didn't tremble in anger. He didn't even seem to be able to see the people around him. His gaze was cold, but entirely unfocused, as though he saw right through everything around him. And then his foot raised and he took another step forward. Bang! Lionel's dangling left shoulder merely glanced by the body of a Brazinger family member. And yet they erupted into a ball of flames before bursting into a shower of blood that was quickly incinerated to ash. This person didn't even get the chance to scream or holler. They were simply eviscerated. At that exact instant, a spaceship that happened to be beneath Lionel's feet was suddenly enveloped by an illusory box formed of spatial force. Before its pilot and crew could even try to maneuver out of it, the box collapsed to a tenth of its original size, squashing them into junk metal. Lionel exhaled just a single breath, seemingly finally breathing for the first time. But just that single breath caused sparks to light in the air. The heat was too much for those in the surrounding 10 meters of him to handle, and they caught on fire. Tragic screams finally broke the silence, and many woke up to the fact that just a single step of Lionel's seemed to be like the call of the Grim Reaper. Rumble! Lionel stepped into Earth's atmosphere for the first time and the world changed. All around, the pristine white clouds rumbled, gathering together and forming enormous behemoth-like monstrosities that thundered with enough force to make the grounds quake and mountains collapse. When the Emperor was furious, the skies would sunder. At that moment, above Lionel's head, the void trembled and an ancient scroll appeared. It radiated a blinding golden light, outshining even the moon blazing to his back. The ancient scroll slowly unfurled. The blinding light it exuded only becoming ever more so. The moment it unfurled completely, surges of lightning coursed through the air, pulsing with golden, green and radiant royal blue arcs. Emperor's Edict. The ancient characters of the Golden Edict rose like a tempest, enveloping the hundreds of kilometers. All those of the Brazinger family. This was the first time Lionel spoke since he appeared. The instant he did, he seemed to conjure the phantom of a malevolent ghost draped in the robes of withering black. Die. The words fell and the world shuddered. The skies whined and gods lamented. The spirits of life shed tears and wraiths of death laughed uproariously. One after another, Almost every single member of the Brazinger family within the range of Lionel's edict suddenly trembled, their gazes turning blank as they fell one after another. Their ships began to fall from the skies, and their flying treasures wheeled out of control. Horror was painted on the faces of the Brazinger family members outside of the barrier as it quickly approached them, seemingly wanting to envelop the entire world. The radiance of the Golden Edict pulsed and surged, being fueled by Lionel's fury and surging through the skies. With just a single sentence, Lionel passed judgment. However, that was when something heart-rending occurred. With a surge, Lionel's inner organs suddenly exploded. In another breath, his right arm imploded and ended up in a similar state to his left. In yet another breath, his knee collapsed, suddenly twisting in the wrong direction and bending at an awkward angle. Despite this occurring, Lionel's expression didn't change a single time. Every time a Brazinger family member managed to resist his edict, another devastating wound would appear on Lionel's body. However, in comparison to those that managed to survive, those that died were far greater in number. Lionel didn't seem to care at all about the damage to himself. He just wanted them to die. He wanted them all to die. The edict above Lionel's head fluttered, and the words changed. The corpses falling from the sky suddenly burst into clouds of blood, surging toward Lionel in a torrential wave. A dark gold light wrapped around Lionel's body and a six-armed, three-headed panda construct took form, roaring into the skies. At the same time, Lionel, who had seemingly been on the brink of death, was suddenly healed, his wounds closing amidst a dark gold light in the blink of an eye. The panda construct raised up two arms, and a familiar metal spirit took form. Little Tali surged toward the squared spaceship Lionel had crushed and enveloped it. Every time the fingers of the panda construct tapped at the air, another change would take place and the skies would rumble all the more. In just a few breaths, Little Tali separated into tens of thousands of pieces, and the skies were enveloped by the light of countless javelins. The humans of Earth were entirely shaken. From the moon being wiped out to the current state of hundreds of Brazingers falling every second, everything had happened too quickly. These vent to their rage had come too suddenly. But why was it that they couldn't feel any sort of happiness? They could tell that Lionel truly had no intention of asking them for help. Not once did he look toward them, and he even seemed to look through them all much the same way he looked through the Brazinger family members. He had come here for slaughter. In fact, he was already wreathed in blood. Chapter 1758. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1758. Carnage. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The remaining four arms of the panda construct raised into the air as a crafting quill appeared in Lionel's left hand. His intent blazed into the skies. For replicas of his crafting quill appearing in each hand, space warped and force surged as Lionel rode across the air. Ancient-looking runes formed one after another, touching a speed that made those who understood what was happening feel as though they were dreaming. Every time Lionel finished another force art, it shot into the skies, filling his surroundings with magic circles of all sorts of colors. The javelins blotted out all the light in the skies, trembling as they passed through these ancient runes one after another. With every completion, their auras changed entirely, the strength they exuded causing countless hearts to skip a beat. Blazing flames, blinding golden lights, twisting vortexes of space. Each and every javelin seemed to have an entirely different shape and form, aimed toward the survivors of the Brazinger family. All the while, Lionel's footsteps hadn't stopped. He continued to walk forward as though nothing could stop his forward momentum. Nothing would halt his massacre on this day. The quills in the panda construct's four hands vanished as the javelins suddenly moved. In one moment, they were almost entirely still, but in the next instant, they flashed forward with such speed that their former location seemed to implode with blasts of concentrated air. Several roars filled the skies as the Brazinger family members seemed to finally snap out of their shock. They had been so caught off guard by the sudden changes that they couldn't even breathe. Watching the moon suddenly be enveloped by flames, its atmosphere burning to ash and the land being buried beneath furious crimson flickers had left them stunned. But the moment they realized what happened, it seemed to settle in all at once. They were all dead? The eyes of the Brazinger warriors turned entirely red. Their berserk god lineage factor surging out of control. Not all members of the Brazinger family had the purest form of the berserk god lineage factor. Many were like Aina before she rained her curse into her control, easily capable of losing themselves in bloodlust and carnage. The instant they were triggered by their fury, their roars shook the skies, wild crimson auras surging from their bodies as they grabbed their weapons and charged forward all at once. But that was when Lionel's javelins descended. A warrior at the front was sucked into a vortex of space. His body shredded to pieces in an instant. The moment the vortex stopped rotating, it spit out the bits and pieces of his flesh and bones, allowing it to rain down from the skies. To his side, a blazing javelin of fire tore through the chest of 3 Brazingers in a row. They ran forward 2 more steps each before they combusted into balls of fire, falling in a rain of ash. On the other side of the battlefield, a javelin rotating with a deep, dark blue collided with a burly man that stood well over 2 meters tall. He had his axe raised above his head, closing the distance on Lionel with speed his body shouldn't have been able to carry. And yet, the instant he met the javelin, it felt as though he had been hit with a sledgehammer. It sounded as though a speeding truck had collided with a steel wall. The burly man exploded on contact, mashed bundles of flesh and blood falling from the skies. Only he knew that he had actually dodged. But it didn't seem to matter. It was as though the entire area around the javelin had become a heavy mass, the air around it becoming part of its power. The massacre was on as large of a scale as his emperor's edict, but the power of the men and women who fell were on a completely different level. This didn't seem to matter to Lionel in the slightest as he cut them down like weeds. Weaker? Stronger? He would kill as many as there were. Lionel's freed 4 arms flipped their palms even as Ria's force quill vanished to be replaced with the white lion bow. In that instant, 4 exact replicas appeared in his 4 palms, raising up 4 bows and aiming them all forward. Each one was over 6 meters from tip to tip, laying horizontally within Lionel's hand. 4 javelins descended from around Ryu, loaded into the bow and slowly pulled the strings back. The scent of death permeated the air. Somehow, the danger seemed to multiple 10 times over, the power of Lionel's archery causing the skies to tremble. Boom, 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 boom. They were all released at once, the air collapsing and the booming calls of thunder being drowned out. Everywhere the javelins passed, dozens died, the residual auras alone capable of ripping everything in their path to pieces. However, even after this, 4 more javelins floated over, knocking into Lionel's 4 bows and pushing their strings back. Wild currents of bow force took shape, spiraling like drill cones. Boom, 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 boom. Lionel alone became like an artillery unit. With every step, dozens would die. Never once did he slow or pause. It was as though his feet were carrying him toward a certain location. He was no different from a god of carnage. Not the slightest fluctuation could be seen in his eyes, his indifference and coldness shining through like a chilly wind that licked across the back of their necks. That's enough. Booming voices of fury layered atop of one another. 4 young geniuses shot forward, 2 men and 2 women. Their gazes blazed with a trail of crimson, but their eyes had a clarity the others simply didn't have. There was no doubt that they had full access to the berserk god lineage factor, each and every one of the being at tier 7 at the very least. They finally closed the distance on Lionel, attacking him from all sides, their power causing the skies to clap like thunder. Chapter 1759. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 10 seconds AM. Chapter 1759. Next, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't even look directly at them. Their speed had little effect on him, just when it seemed that their attacks would envelop him entirely, until his 4 bows suddenly shifted. The 4 youths froze, suddenly finding the tips of 4 javelins pointed toward each one of their faces. There were no words exchanged, no roar of fury, not even a single glance. With a slight pull, The bowstrings shot out like iron balls from a cannon, colliding with their heads before they could react and shattering them to pieces. The Brazinger family members didn't even get a chance to sigh a breath of relief. Those four had been some of their best talents. If they were placed in the Void Palace, even the Cataclysm generation wouldn't be able to stand up to them. Or at the very least, the vast majority of the Cataclysm generation would be helpless. And yet, Lionel didn't seem to take them seriously at all. His bow aiming and firing just once, shredding them all to pieces. At that moment, Simeon, who had turned to watch all of this with an indifferent expression, narrowed his gaze. In just the few moments since Lionel had appeared, over 10% of the people he had brought died, constituting thousands of lives. And even then, he didn't seem nearly satisfied at all. What was even clearer was the fact that Lionel was walking forward in a line that couldn't have been straighter, a line that aimed and directed right toward him. From the beginning, Lionel hadn't said a word to Simeon. In fact, he hadn't even looked toward him. He didn't suddenly lose himself in a tempest of rage, nor did he demand a thing. If he wanted something, he would take it, for being a part of not only the death of his brothers, to also use them as puppets after their death, filled Lionel with more rage than he knew how to put in words. Within his body, his scarlet star innate nodes trembled with a red-gold light, causing the flickering flames that danced in the surroundings to dance with a menacing cadence. With every step forward Lionel took, he closed the distance between himself and Simeon. He had already been enraged past the point of no return before he even stepped foot back on Earth. But now, what's going on? What happened here? Joel looked up into the skies, his gaze sharpening as he watched the dark clouds above rumble. Currently, 3 of Lionel's brothers were side by side. They couldn't see what was happening currently because the trio, Joel, Arnold and Alan, were training in the depths of the ocean. In fact, if their time during the last decade or so was accounted for, it could be said that over 90% of it was spent here. Even after so long, the oceans of Earth were still an incredibly dangerous place. They were simply far too large, and the number of individuals with water-based abilities that could properly fight in this region, although not rare, were far too few. The advantage the beasts born and raised in this region had was unprecedented, and after the disappearance of the koi fish, many other king beasts had risen up to threaten the populations of Earth, things only becoming worse with every step of evolution. Beasts were different from other races in this way. Much of their talent was ingrained and their progression speed was decided both at birth and by their environments. As such, it could be said that the most talented population of living beings on Earth weren't the humans themselves, but rather the oceanic beasts. This couldn't be helped. While Earth's humans were born with a great amount of talent, this talent mostly came from their ability indexes. They lacked the guidance of techniques to make perfect use of their strength, and as such were mostly self-taught through battle, or using the creations of others as reference. Much of these issues would be fixed if Earth had a few main lineage factors, but while Earth likely had the largest concentration of sparks in the whole of the human domain, they still hadn't had the time to grow to their full potential yet. Due to this, the ocean was the perfect training ground, at least to them. Most wouldn't dare to make use of it as they had, but the 3 of them wanted revenge more than anything else, and they knew that they were far too weak in this state. They would claw back everything those 4 families had taken from them. The commotion is large, Alan replied. We should go and check it out. The 3 looked toward one another and nodded, not wasting any more time as they shot toward that direction, the speed leaving trenches in the deep and dark waters. You seem to be very angry, Simeon sneered, looking toward Lionel. It seemed obvious that there wouldn't be anyone here capable of stopping Lionel from closing in the final distance. No matter what talents were thrown at him, Lionel slaughtered them all. He didn't seem to know fatigue. He didn't tire, he didn't rest, he didn't even seem to be breathing heavily. His force was like an endless abyss. Simeon's sneer darkened when he saw that Lionel had no intention of responding before his expression returned to normal, his sneer even deepening. Fine. I'll show you what true helplessness looks like. I'll let you see that before me. You were never worth anything at all. Boom. The platform beneath Simeon shuddered, and the knees of Raj and Drake uncontrollably bent in the skies as Simeon's aura could rise. Simeon's crimson hair fluttered wildly, his red eyes piercing through the veil as Raj and Drake prostrated, holding up the platform on their hands and knees. The towering presence of a seventh-dimensional expert tore a hole through the dark clouds. You want to defeat me with just this level of strength? Even if you were in the seventh dimension, I wouldn't fear you, let alone now. You have no idea the kind of monster you're poking at. Do you think the blood running through your veins can match up to even a single % of mine? The Brazinger family, the Aderna family, the Lavis family, the Critis family. These are all unfathomable existences you cannot possibly begin to comprehend. At that moment, Lionel finally seemed to look at Simeon. For the first time, he didn't just look through him. He looked right into the very depths of his soul. It was such a shudderingly cold look that Simeon felt his soul freeze over entirely, his body stopping in place and his next words being caught in his throat. And then Lionel's lips slowly parted. Aderna, Lavis, Critis. I've already destroyed them all. Lionel's head tilted slightly to the side in a fashion that felt decidedly demonic and devilish, wisps of crimson fog forming tails out of the corner of his eyes. His words seemed to come out in whispers that manifested like sharp hisses in one's ear, almost to the point of metal scraping against metal. The Brazingers will follow them now. Simeon's pupils constricted. Chapter 1760. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1760. Entirely if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Bullshit. Simeon roared out, his voice coming out like a concentrated blast of air. He realized almost immediately that he had been agitated by just a few words. If Lionel was really lying, was there a need to react so violently? His expression turned ugly, the concentrated breath of air that came from his roar falling into complete silence when it reached Lionel. It was as though they were standing in two completely different worlds. Simeon had thought a lot about how this day would go. The day he finally met Lionel again. This was a man he had lost at the hands of terribly before, forced to run away with his tail between his legs, because of Lionel. He had missed an opportunity to meditate at the center of a force eruption. And that was something he would never forget. But even worse than that, the third time he met Lionel, when he and the other three young geniuses of the Aderna, Critis and Lavis families were hunting the golden-scaled koi fish. He was once again humiliated, and this time, Lionel didn't even seem to use any effort to force them into a state of trepidation. While it was true that they hadn't fought during that third interaction, the genius of the Aderna family paying Lionel back for saving his little sister, and thus holding them back, Simeon could still remember that look of cold indifference in Lionel's eyes as though he didn't take him seriously at all. The very same look Lionel was giving him now, even disregarding the gap in their dimensions. Simeon had lost his composure the moment he decided to speak so much in the first place. He had been dreaming about the day Lionel saw him use his brothers as puppets. Dreaming about the rage that would be in his eyes. Dreaming about the helplessness in his expression. But now they were finally here. And he saw none of that. There was nothing but a fathomless depth. Simeon's expression twisted, his fury boiling over as the whites of his eyes pulsed with crimson veins. However, after a moment, he exhaled a breath, suddenly regaining his calm. Fight this man personally? Was he even worthy? He would do what he had always done with the ants beneath his feet. Drown them. Simeon waved a hand and his 8 lenses rotated until they came to a stop with a glowing lens taking the center position. A pulse of spatial force rippled before him, causing a rip in reality to form. Out from his rip, one after another, grotesque monstrosities stepped out, each exuding an aura that oppressed the world. The first was a werewolf covered in crimson fur and a flaming mane. It had claws that were over a meter long, dangling lower than even the soles of its feet. These claws seemed to be a solid silver metal at times, but at others, it would ripple and become plumes of fire. Dancing between solid and translucent states. The second was a cobbled-together mess of circuits, wires, tubes and flesh. Its head seemed to be its body and its arms came out from its ears, and while its legs came out from its neck, Pulsing flesh that looked like brains were plastered all over it with seemingly no rhyme or reason. The third was seemingly a ball of water, but its insides squirmed about with intestines that looked like they had been ripped right out of a human and preserved within the water. And, while it looked no different from water, the smell it gave off was that of a strong sulfuric acid, burning the nose hairs of even those hundreds of miles away. The others were all just as terrible, making them all look like science fair projects that had gone terribly wrong. Kill him! A ball of acid surged forward, suddenly forming a tsunami-like wall, the intestines within it becoming exposed to the air and combusting everything they came into contact with. The air caught on fire with a green flame that exuded a smell that made one's stomach turn. The crimson werewolf took a step and vanished, becoming a line of fire as it rotated to Lionel's back. Its speed was impossible to track with the naked eye, its claws slicing through the air to bisect Lionel from the hip. The flesh mech soared high about Lionel's head, crashing down toward his panda construct's head even as its parts sparked and oozed oil and brain juice. All the while, Lionel didn't move a single inch, his crimson gaze still peering into Simeon's soul. Simeon's soul continued to shudder. For some reason, his body felt cold, and no matter how he circulated his force, he couldn't heat himself up. Just when Lionel was about to be forced to take out attacks from all sides, an inconspicuous violet fog took form, forming pockets above him, below him, to his left, right, and to his front and back. The violet fog swirled and suddenly sent ripples in space. Clang, 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 clang. Simeon's face suddenly paled to a sheet of white. All around Lionel, valiant warriors stepped out, wafting a royal violet fog that made them look like shimmering nebulas. They looked both real and unreal, both corporeal and incorporeal. However, each one of them donned an armor that made one's heart palpitate. What shook Simeon to his core, though, wasn't this. Rather, it was the shields of force they used to block his puppets and the auras they exuded. Before each valiant warrior, there was a barrier of thin transparent blue energy. Every so often, a ripple would appear over it every so often, especially when it was disrupted. When this ripple spread, the small dragon-like scales this barrier was formed by became slightly more obvious before it settled down again. This energy, no, this lineage factor. This was the lineage factor of the Aderna family. But even worse than that was the auras all of these valiant warriors exuded. Without fail, each and every one of them was in the seventh dimension. The portals of violet fog continued to pulse, more and more experts standing out one after another. Before Simeon could even blink once, more than 100 had appeared, each of them wearing mighty violet armor. Bang! With a slight grunt, the valiant warriors caused Simeon's puppets to implode, their bodies being shredded to pieces one after another. All at once, these valiant souls turned their heads toward Simeon. At that moment, it all sank in. Lionel wasn't lying at all. The Aderna family, he had already wiped them out. Not only had he wiped them out, he snatched their souls from the afterlife to do battle for him. He was a demon. Simeon looked toward Lionel's tilted head, and his heart stopped beating entirely. Chapter 1761. Published at 10th of April, 2023, 11:04 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1761. Rise if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1761. Rise. The 6 valiant warriors around Lionel shot forward. Lionel didn't even seem to need to personally control them at all, as though his gaze being focused on Simeon alone was enough to communicate everything that needed to be. Simeon's expression warped, his pale features twisting as his lenses quickly rotated. It was clear that he couldn't be casual any longer. The seventh-dimensional experts of the 4 families weren't individuals he could look down on, and somehow, they didn't seem to have lost any strength at all after falling into Lionel's clutches. Simeon couldn't wrap his head around how Lionel could possibly control seventh-dimensional souls to begin with, let alone so many of them at the same time. He didn't even seem to be struggling. It was one thing for Simeon because his puppets were genetically modified. He didn't have to actively maintain control over them. They were bred into slaves with his own unique mark. They were reared to have a sort of symbiotic relationship with him that forced them to listen to him no matter what. Other than directing them, he didn't need to waste any stamina in controlling them. But Simeon knew Lionel didn't have his ability index. And even if Lionel did, it was clear that this method wasn't the same as his own. So how was this happening? One after another, strong summons stepped out and surrounded Simeon. The more that appeared, the less grotesque and more normal they became. But it was precisely this that made them so much more powerful than the others. It was clear that the closer to normal evolution Simeon's puppets reached, the more power they were able to output. An all-out war broke out in the skies. Simeon might have only recently entered the 7th dimension in the last few years, but his number of 7th-dimensional puppets wasn't small. In fact, they outnumbered Lionel's own, unfortunately for him. Though, the quality of Lionel's was far beyond his own. And to make matters worse, 10 of Simeon's puppets managed to surround one of Lionel's valiant warriors, their fists and legs lashing out all at once and suffocating it to the point it could react. Bang! The soul construct shattered, unable to withstand the blow. But just when Simeon's puppets were about to rush toward another section of the battlefield, under his astonished gaze, the valiant warrior's illusory pieces fused back together once more, throwing out a sudden punch that caused the puppets off guard and killed 3 of them in a single strike. Simeon's expression was ashen. Lionel only continued to walk forward slowly, closing in the distance with every stride. He felt invincible, as though there was absolutely nothing that could happen that could stop his forward momentum. Suddenly, Simeon realized how useless it was to take Lionel's brothers as puppets. He couldn't use them as bait or hostages, and Lionel didn't even seem to react to their existence at all. What good were corpses in threatening a man who was living and breathing? He could tell that Lionel was doing it on purpose. With Lionel's speed, how could he have not closed the distance yet? With his strength, how could he not have attacked directly yet? With his means, why wasn't he ahead on a pike yet? Lionel wanted him to feel despair. He wanted him to feel helpless. He wanted him to feel small. He wanted him to feel as though there was nothing in the world that could save him. No man, no God, no existence. For a moment, it seemed that Lionel himself was the one with 6 arms and 3 heads. He was the demon striding through the skies. What surrounded him wasn't just a construct at all. It was a projection of the darkness in his soul. Suddenly, several roars rocked the skies. Hundreds of men and women with streaming tears in their eyes burst through the dense and dark storm clouds. Lightning crackled around them, sometimes even lashing against their skin, but they didn't seem to notice at all. Their faces were already covered in soot, their clothes partially or almost entirely burnt off. It was clear at a glance who these individuals were. They were the survivors of Lionel's devastation of the moon. And for them to have survived such a thing, there was no doubt that each and every one of them was an expert of the 7th dimension. Seeing this, Simeon finally breathed, seeing a small light of hope. The Brazingers were all warriors, and they were all more powerful in a state of fury. Simeon simply didn't believe they couldn't turn this around. However, in his search for a light of hope, Simeon had forgotten something very important. Lionel had already done this 3 times before. How had Lionel, a man merely at tier 1 of the 6th dimension, been able to fight a battle against so many absolute geniuses of the 7th dimension? The answer was that he hadn't. Lionel continued to walk forward, his stride never changing. He wanted Simeon to feel the greatest despair. What greater despair was there than feeling a final light of hope, only for it to be shattered to pieces before even gaining a chance to bloom? High in the skies, barely within Earth's orbit, the rotating cannons of a flagship the size of a moon finally cooled. Slowly, it turned from facing the moon toward Earth, a shift occurring through its artillery units one by one. Back on the Earth, the furious roars of the Brazinger family's 7th-dimensional experts caused the forest to tremble, the ground to quake and the tides to rise. The Earthlings on the ground could only turn pale, their blood running cold. Hand over your life. A fiery-haired woman with tears streaming down her face was the first to arrive. Her sister had just died in her arms, just a small 5th-dimensional expert who couldn't survive in the harshness of space. What chance had she stood with the atmosphere of the moon being burnt to ash? The fiery-haired woman's strength was unprecedented. Everywhere she passed, whether it was Simeon's puppets or Lionel's valiant warriors, they burst into a rain of blood and motes of light, unable to stop her for even a single moment. She appeared above Lionel's head, her fist tearing through the void as she punched downward. Just the momentum of her strike alone caused Lionel's panda construct to ripple and almost collapse. "Return my sister to me." Her shrill shrieks curdled one's blood, her hair furiously whipping out in all directions. However, right then, a beam of light that split the world in two descended. Lionel didn't even turn back to face her. Her last sight in this world was the indifferent casualness of his back view. Bang. She was incinerated to ashes. Simeon froze. Hope had only appeared for a fleeting moment before it vanished in a buff of smoke and a rain of ash. All he could see in this world was the look in Lionel's eyes as his lips slowly separated. "Rise." Lionel's soft words reverberated through the world, causing a vortex of power to form around the ashes of the fallen woman. Soon, a valiant woman donning violet illusory armor appeared, her crimson hair fluttering as she kneeled toward Lionel, her head lowered in absolute obedience. More chapters later today, that you're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.